Hello and welcome back to this Damned Idealistic Crusade. I am the motion picture analyst, and this is my next in the series of James Bond commentaries I've been doing. Today we'll be talking about Bond 18, otherwise known as Tomorrow Never Dies, released in December of 1997. It is the second film of the Pierce Brosnan era, following the great success of 1995's GoldenEye, which successfully relaunched the series after the 6-year gap hiatus post License to Kill. Tomorrow Never Dies was quickly put into production to follow up on GoldenEye's success and provide another hit moneymaker for MGM, who still badly needed it. And the film started out with the hard release date of, Christmas 1997, which really put the producers and the whole production team up against it. And the film is well known for having a troubled production, but I don't think many people have ever read into just quite how troubled and how up against it everyone found themselves in the midst of production, where they went into shooting without a completed screenplay. And studying the scripting process and how this all came to be, and how the original screenplay was essentially thrown out and reworked as they shot, is the real reason why the film is kind of underbaked in places and underdeveloped. And really what they needed was more time to finesse it, but they did not have that, since MGM insisted on the 1997 release date. Had the film come out shortly later in 1998 at a different time, I think they would have had that necessary time to finesse things. I'll try to go into some of that scripting process throughout this track, because this is one of those films that you really do need to look at that to understand why things turned out the way they did. And ultimately, I think they actually improved a number of things in the process and actually strengthened a lot of the plot points, particularly in with the villain's goals, and everything seems very well honed. It's just certain elements and certain characters I think really required some extra finessing to really make them come to life. Tomorrow Never Dies is a film that perhaps underwhelms on the first viewing. I know when I saw it on its theatrical release, I remember some people, because I went with my parents, we went as a family, and I remember some people having some grumblings afterwards as it was a little underwhelming in places. The film is often criticized for being nonstop action and having a shorter runtime and feeling maybe a tad bit mechanical and not having the nuance that GoldenEye had. But again, I think a lot of people just really don't know how much of a troubled production this was. And the more you dig into it, and the more that comes across when you read the first draft, which is available online. You can read Bruce Fierstein's first draft, or if you read Raymond Benson's novelization, which is seemingly based on a slightly earlier draft, okay, because the ending sequence is a little bit different. It does retain the original exterior battle on the outside of the stealth ship, which was in a previous draft. There were other writers that came in after Bruce Fierstein, and then famously there was a writers' conference for an idea brainstorming process to sort of pick new ideas from, because they had so little time for Fierstein to rewrite his screenplay that they literally got a bunch of people together in a room just to pick their brains. The whole process was actually very convoluted and was not helped by the fact that MGM was constantly going, okay, but we got to have it out in December 97 no matter what. It is a film that actually I think really rewards repeat viewings, and of the Brosnan era, I think it's the one film of the four that really opens up over time. I remember I would rewatch it with the other films over and over growing up, but I could never really warm up to it in the way that I could the other films. So it was one of the ones that I didn't choose to rewatch as often. I enjoyed seeing it in the theater as a kid, and I enjoyed rewatching it, and I like specific elements. But it really wasn't until I was much older and I had become accustomed to the film that I guess eventually something kind of clicked for me. And I suddenly realized there is nuance in the film, and it's really the production hurdles that I think really cause a number of these issues. And there were a number of on-set squabbles, and everybody didn't necessarily get along. And again, none of this was really helped by the fact that they were really under the gun and did not have a completed screenplay. The film is celebrated, and with good reason, for its notable set pieces, and ironically, really, that's all they had going in were the major set pieces. They had the sinking of the Devonshire, which sets up the plot. They had the opening pre-title sequence, and then they had the bike chase, and they had the car chase in the parking garage. Everything else was being rewritten or reworked from the earlier drafts. So, needless to say, there is a reason why the action set pieces are major set pieces. There was a bit of a switch up in the production crew, of course. We switched directors from Martin Campbell and Goldeneye to Roger Spottiswoode on Tomorrow Never Dies, and it's unknown for sure if Campbell was actually approached or if he was already busy with The Mask of Zorro, but I think the idea was that he really wanted to do something else. He didn't feel he could do 2 Bond films in a row, which is perfectly understandable, but I think Spottiswoode is actually very underrated for the job he did on Tomorrow Never Dies. I know the on-set reports and things that have survived, seem to indicate that he didn't really get along with anyone in the production or the production team. He kind of was an outsider of sorts, but I think he was tapped for his work on films like Under Fire and then Air America and other things. And he has said in interviews that he was approached to perhaps do something earlier in the Dalton era. So apparently he had been one of the names under consideration for a time. And of course, his background prior to becoming a director, most notably, was being in the editing team and being an editor for the legendary Sam Peckinpah. And I think it's that factor that's very key in why Tomorrow Never Dies actually works, and that is because the editing is extraordinarily tight. As I said before, Tomorrow Never Dies has a very short runtime. It is the first James Bond film, really since You Only Live Twice, to clock significantly under 2 hours, at an hour and 56 minutes. There had not been a Bond film. Diamonds Are Forever basically runs about 2 hours, so I don't necessarily count it. And there's an importance to a Bond film having a tighter runtime. It harkens back to the traditional Peter Hunt style of the rapid cut editing that injects a fast and furious energy to the proceedings. And I think Tomorrow Never Dies does have a little bit of that. And of course, they were having to cut as they shot. This was the first Bond film that was edited digitally on an Avid system, and they literally were able to literally have the entire film almost completely cut and finished by the time production ended, because there was literally no post-production period. They had no time at all for post whatsoever, which seems insane, but that's another reason why I just don't think they had the time to really finesse the film, because there was literally no post period. That led to many issues. Again, they had to have everything literally ready and done. They even did the handful, the bits of CG that are in the film. All the pre-renders were done, and so when they actually previewed the film, it was with the pre-rendered CG. So everything was pretty much had to be ready to go and done by the time production was finished. So I think he was shooting and thinking with how these pieces were going to cut together. And again, they were having to improvise on a daily basis. And Bruce Fierstein was on the set having to rewrite as they went along, which doesn't help anybody. And I think that's the film's real shortcoming, is that they didn't have the time to finesse things. And I do think there are riches in the film. I do think it does have great things in it. I think it does play really well, and ironically, it plays better now than I think it did in 1997, because people don't make films like this anymore. It did have a significantly large budget at slightly over $100 million, which was practically double what GoldenEye's budget had. Since GoldenEye had been successful for MGM, they decided to not be as tight-fisted with the budget this time around for the second Bond film, and plus they really needed the hit. They needed the money and the prestige that a hit Bond film would give them, and this is going back to how MGM treated Bond in the 1980s, where they literally lived off of the success and money each Bond film brought in, because they didn't have anything else working for them at the time. So really, I think the film's major shortcoming is the time crunch, and that's also what happened. If we look historically at the films, it's what happened on The Man with the Golden Gun, with that film's scripting problems, jumping back and forth between the Mankiewicz and Maybaum drafts, and they sort of rushed into it. And in hindsight, everyone admitted that was really not the best idea. And unfortunately, Tomorrow Never Dies has that same problem. But again, I think over time, time the film really opens up and you're able to really get into it more. I don't think it's perfect. There are definitely some things that I still have some issue with, but I think pretty much all of them can be chalked up to the fact that they went into the shooting without a real script to work from. And again, the scripting process you really have to go into. So I guess I'll put that in my pre-ramble here. Of course, originally they went to the noted author Donald Westlake, who actually completed an entire treatment, and that was ultimately rejected. It did deal somewhat with the Hong Kong handover, which was also the subject of the original Fierstein draft that was discarded. But anyway, Westlake's version has now finally been published. You can read that in book form. But that actually took up some time, of course. So when that was completely, thrown out, that meant they had even less time to work. And then Bruce Fierstein came up with his concept. And the actual line he has Carver say in the film, words of the new weapons, satellites to the new artillery, was his literal pitch to Eon and MGM for having a media mogul as the villain. And then it became the major plot, but it revolved around the handover of Hong Kong back to China, which took place in 1997, and was actually the subject of many things at that time. Unfortunately, MGM decided that it would date the film too much because, of course, the handover happened earlier in 1997. The film would come out in December. I don't really think most people would have minded. I think it would have been seen maybe then as more over what happened behind the scenes that nobody knew about. But I can understand the reasoning. However, deciding to throw out the entire script at that point when production was ramping up to literally begin was not wise, and especially when you decided to not change the release date, and that's what caused the major scripting problems. So Bruce Fierstein's first draft, which you can read, is very rough. It does have a lot of problems, but it has some interesting things, and the basic framework of the story is there. We have the media mogul villain, we have the Devonshire and stuff, but that doesn't occur really to the second act. And then there's a whole subplot about plutonium and things like that, and it really seems that got recycled for The World Is Not Enough. Zukovsky makes a reappearance, so there are ideas we see turn up in the next film, but you can see the framework of Tomorrow Never Dies as we know it there. But again, it is very rough and it does have a lot of problems. But again, it was just a first draft. We don't really have access to all the other drafts. Again, as I mentioned before, eventually Eon literally called together a writers' conference, much like what you get in television where you have a writers' room. And so all these various talents were brought in, including, of all people, Nicholas Meyer, the great brain behind some of the best Star Trek films, and also the great Sherlock Holmes pastiche, 7% Solution. He had a really, he came up with a really out there, very striking concept that unfortunately was a whole movie in and of itself, and they just kind of threw it out the window. But that's still a fascinating concept if you haven't heard of it. His whole thing was it being a Bond villain whose goal was to combat the problem of overpopulation, and who had cold but irrefutable logic that was very striking. Again, fascinating concept, but that's a whole movie in and of itself. I think it would still make a great basis for a Bond film. But out of this, they came up with some ideas that apparently made it into the next couple drafts, and then some of those writers took a hand at writing on the film. They are uncredited, but you have David Wilson and Dan Petrie who did drafts and contributed things, and then eventually Bruce Fierstein came back and I think sort of looked at some of the stuff that other people had come up with, but essentially kind of went in and sort of polished up what he had started, incorporating some of those elements, and then he was having to do this literally on the set as they went, and that's never the way to shoot a movie. Ironically, in the GoldenEye commentary, Michael G. Wilson says that's an unfortunate thing that happens in modern films, that you're having to write as you go along and constantly rewrite because the script is in trouble. And he literally, it's towards the end of that commentary, and he's like, that's always a bad sign when you're a movie having to do that. And lo and behold, that's literally what they started going through right after they recorded that commentary track. So I find that very prophetic that he's saying that at the end of the GoldenEye track. And of course, they did have these scripting problems on GoldenEye, but they had the time to finesse it, and Bruce Fierstein was the final writer on GoldenEye, and that script had, been pulled apart and reshaped and rewritten by multiple hands over a substantial period of time. Tomorrow Never Dies didn't have that luxury. So you've got all this going into it, and I think it's Spottiswoode really getting the cut down that helps hide a lot of this stuff. And again, it is a film that clocks under 2 hours. I think that really does help a lot of the issues with character and a lot of the things that feel a bit underwritten. It helps kind of gloss over some of that. It does kind of make it a bit more of a big budget machine like assembly line action film, if you will, which is usually what most people label it as, but then they just kind of leave it at that and they go along. And I do think the film has a lot more going for it, and I think that quicker editing and that quicker pace does help it move along, and I think that's really key, but it needs some more nuance. And then on top of that, you have Pierce Brosnan pushing constantly, as he did throughout his tenure, to get more to sink his teeth into, and you get another moments like the beach scene in Goldeneye with the whole Paris character and their and the love scene that takes place in Bond's hotel room that is trying to sort of push past the barriers of the formula and the film character and try to give some deeper contextual meaning to things going on. And while I like the idea, it needs more fleshing out. And I think it would have gotten that. It just unfortunately we didn't get that time period for all of the finessing that was necessary for the script. So again, I think all the problems with the film can be traced back to the very difficult production. And really, Roger Spottiswoode did manage to pull it off and get the film done on time. And I mean, it was a Herculean task, really, when you look at what he was up against. And again, all we have are, unfortunately, a lot of tabloid on-set reports that did, literally, ironically, like the film's plot, rewrite things and created their own news. So it's fitting with the film's plot there. Again, it's a film that I think plays better now because people aren't making large budget globe-trotting action pictures like this that are still doing primarily everything for real and have a plot that is very, very believable. I think the closest you get, of course, is the continuing Mission Impossible series, which seems to continually try to pull as much as it can from the Bond formula without getting a lawsuit slapped on it. And it's surprising how much Tomorrow Never Dies seems to open over time and again over repeat viewings. It also helps that it has just an absolute powerhouse of a sound mix. I still remember vividly seeing this in the theater in DTS. This is perhaps my favorite sound mix to run in my own home theater environment. This is a film that cries out for home theater. If you're not watching this in 5.1, you're really not experiencing it properly. It's a really fantastic presentation, and that increases the film's impact all the more. I definitely didn't get the same experience when I was growing up watching it on tape on a TV via VCR, and then it wasn't really until I was able to watch the film in a home theater environment that I was able to really get engaged in it again. So I think that's another key thing, is that the technical aspects are very much even improved over Goldeneye, which still has a really lovely sound mix that I love and adore. But Tomorrow Never Dies takes it to another level, really incredible, because they had no post-production time, so they were also mixing as they went along. But it may be my favorite sound mix of the 5.1 era. It's still unmatched. I still adore it. So if you have not seen this film in a proper theater environment or in a home theater, you are definitely missing out, and it adds another layer of experience to this film. Perhaps what most people would agree on is the film's score being much more traditional. This was the first score done by David Arnold, who became the go-to composer for the next couple of years, and he really brings a great love for the series and a great devotion to John Barry's scoring styles. And while it is a much more traditional score, I really enjoy the portions of the score where it's Arnold following more of his muse and when he's being less deferential to John Barry, because there are moments in the score where he is almost like quoting Barry moments and Barryisms, and that really kind of pulls me out of the movie. I really enjoy it much more when he's just going for what he feels is intrinsically necessary to the scene. But again, the production plays a hand there because he had to score the film piecemeal. So he would get sections as they were completed, and he would have to score it. And then ironically, this led to the soundtrack having the same problem that Thunderball did back in 1965, where when they prepared the soundtrack, the scoring wasn't finished. So it only features music primarily from the first half of the film. Then we had to wait another 3 years to get a CD with more music from the second half, but then that dropped the songs, and it's still not complete. Hopefully we can still get a complete 2 CD release of the complete score someday, like The World's Not Enough and Die Another Day finally did. It is a much more traditional score than the Eric Serra score for GoldenEye, but I still really like what Serra was trying to do, and even though it is very experimental, I feel like Arnold really nailed more of his style on The World's Not Enough because it's much more cohesive. But again, I think a lot of that is because he did have to score Tomorrow Never Dies piecemeal, not just because it was his first Bond score and he was a fan and he was probably a little bit nervous and had all this energy to try and get it right, but I think had he been able to score the film in its complete form, and not have to do it piecemeal, section by section, and constantly second guess himself, I think it would be a lot more cohesive, like The World's Not Enough. And even Die Another Day has a bit more of that. But it's still a score that I really enjoy and has great moments. But I tend to enjoy more of the transitional moments where he's following more of his own muse. But I'll get into that and try and highlight some of those as we go along. But enough of me babbling. That's my pre-ramble, as I like to call it, at the start of each of these tracks. I try to bring up some of the highlights of what I'm going to go over, but it's hard to go along and do scene-by-scene analysis and character analysis and keep up with the film and then try to pepper it along with production facts and things. I try to gather my thoughts at the beginning and sort of give an introduction so that way you know what you're getting into when you go into one of my commentary tracks. Again, as always, these are not professionally recorded. They are not meant to be definitive in any way. It's just essentially my own thought process about this film and what's going on in my brain when I rewatch it every year, as I do the rest of the series, and all of the baggage I bring to the table with each individual Bond film, which seems to be an ever-increasing amount as I always try to encompass any new material or information I can get my hands on. And with the Brosnan era, there is a lot more to go on compared to the early films, because since they're much more modern and they have much more press coverage and things like that, we have actual on-set indicators and other voices and things, and they're most of the production personnel are still with us. You can get more it's easier to get detailed information than it is, say, the original films of the 1960s. So you can read into the Brosnan films a lot more and sort of peek behind the curtain a lot more because, again, it's just the information is more readily available. And with Tomorrow Never Dies, I really hope someday we can see what those in-between drafts are like. And, of course, we only have glimpses of what that writer's room was like. Again, I'll also try and highlight some things that Raymond Benson brought to the table with his novelization. And of course, ironically, his first James Bond novel was published in 1997, 0-10, and literally dealt with the Hong Kong handover and a villain who was, personally had his feathers ruffled by this and was the head of a great, a business empire, and it's very much like the backstory plot of Bruce Feirstein's original approach of the film script that dealt with the Hong Kong handover. So it's ironic that we actually did get a Bond story in 97 that did deal with the Hong Kong handover, and it went over fine. So it's like, could the film have gone this way? So it's interesting to look at that parallel and look at Benson's 0-10 novel and sort of compare how that, or I should say look at how that contrasts with the Bond film of the same year, Tomorrow Never Dies. So with that being said, go ahead and go to your own copy of the film, whichever way you want to watch, and try to go ahead and cue it up to the black screen area just before the gun barrel iris comes in. That way you skip past the logos, and we can hopefully get on, somewhere around the same page. Again, don't worry if the sync isn't exactly perfect, because everybody's probably going to be looking at a different copy of the film. But I've found if you skip past the logos, because they're usually a bit different on various releases, we should be able to get roughly on the same page, so that way you'll be able to keep up with me, at least pretty close. So go to your copy now, and we'll do a rough count in. So in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, press play now. So here in the opening titles, the very confident David Arnold gun barrel. Has a nice classical feel to it. We have Brosnan's triumphant barrel turn. Nice return of the traditional James Bond theme. And then I like the nice trail off. Now, of course, originally the pre-title sequence was supposed to open with the introduction of Bond having to do a very treacherous climb up frozen ice flows with like an ice axe and stuff, but it was apparently far too dangerous to shoot, and they couldn't do it for real, so eventually they just had to abandon that and just leave the introduction of Bond with the gag about smoking, which I think was a nice way to sort of acknowledge the backlash against smoking, and that's why we don't really see Bond, smoking his traditional cigarettes, as Fleming always had him do. We only saw it occasionally in the films, but the whole Filthy Habit line being a sort of a nod to that. Now we're in the Situation Room. It's our first glimpse of Colin Salmon's Robinson, who is the Tanner replacement, because apparently Michael Kitchen was, previously engaged and couldn't reprise his role as Bill Tanner. Now you can already see that this film is going to have a large usage of video screens, because of course we have Carver and his media empire. But you can see visually it's a very different look and feel to what Phil Mayhew did on GoldenEye. Tomorrow Never Dies was shot by Robert Elswit, who has gone on to actually shoot some of the Mission Impossible films. But Roger Spottiswoode talks about a lot in the commentary that he does, which is actually very rewarding if you listen to it, that visually they had to really combat the usage of video screens everywhere, because they were shooting in traditional anamorphic. And so they had to use, a lot of extra light, and they had to shoot around the limitations of the video screen. So Tomorrow Never Dies has a particular look to it. It's, a bit brighter, a bit contrastier, whereas GoldenEye had a particular sheen to it that had like a high gloss. Tomorrow Never Dies has, admittedly, it's a more techie feel in a way. And of course, there are computers everywhere and video screens everywhere and cell phones and things like that. But, right off the bat, you can tell it's got a different feel to it. We have a little bit of the political machinations going on between departments here, where M is sort of the logical, rational mind, being the head of the intelligence division, and of course it's the rattling the saber quality of the Admiral Roebuck character that sets up the problem in hand. I do like that we get the built-up reveal of Bond, which is always dramatic. It's usually saved for an actor's introduction as Bond, but it's nice that we get this, and we get the establishment of Bond as a perfect field agent, because he knows that there's an atomic missile sitting there on the plane wing, and is insisting that he's got to get it out of there, and that they can't fire a cruise missile then. And, of course, had it not been for Bond, all the plutonium would have gone around and made Chernobyl look like a picnic. But there are little great moments like that scattered throughout this film. And, of course, the great line that the Admiral has once it's revealed, can't you people keep anything locked up? Which just never fails to crack me up. Now, already you can hear David Arnold really picking up the pace and going for full drama with all the missile cutaways. There's the line, of course. But I have to admit, once the action kicks in, while it's great and all, I've never been very big on Vic Armstrong as the second unit director. And, of course, he's a legendary stuntman. But there's just something about his work on Tomorrow Never Dies and The World's Not Enough that just... particularly the action sequences, like you'll see here, a lot of people have labeled Tomorrow Never Dies as sort of the video game Bond once the action kicks in. That it's Bond just going around and he's got a machine gun, or he'll have the AK-47 here in a moment, and he's just, just bullets are going off everywhere, explosions going everywhere, but it doesn't quite have that direct connection, it's I mean, everything is literally done for real, and it looks great and stuff, but it just doesn't have a charge to it all the time. So this is why it really helps when you have the sound mix up really loud, because again, the sound mix of this film is just exceptional and really adds to the experience to an incredible degree that, again, I think it's really a crime to see this film outside of a theater or even a home theater environment, because you lose so much of that impact. And Bond mowing down with the machine gun out of the plane cockpit is a pure trailer moment. Of course, was used in all the trailers. But I do like the fact that Bond is navigating into the terrorist bazaar and taking over the plane and getting it out, of course in the nick of time, but that he's having to literally take everything apart and make his way in. So in that way, it's sort of similar to Bond taking over the Hercules in The Living Daylights and the airbase climax. Again, if you look very closely, you can see every shot is held just to the exact point where the cut makes sense. So no shot runs too long. And again, the editing of this film is I think probably a textbook in a lot of ways in terms of timing the shots just right and never letting any shot run too long without getting into the quick, choppy MTV music video editing style that really took off in the mid to late 1980s and especially through the 90s, and has now become, unfortunately, a de facto standard on steroids. But again, when you go back to the notion that Spottiswoode was Sam Peckinpah's editor, on several films, it definitely that training, that experience does not go away, and it really is what holds this film together, I think. But of course, what sells this entire sequence is the look in Brosnan's eyes and the close-ups as he's prepping the plane to take off on the extremely short runway. Of course, the gag is that the fireball supposedly kills Bond when the monitors then all go out. And of course, you could make the argument that Bond flying through the flames is very much like Bond going through the flames in the tanker and the end of License to Kill. And while that would be enough for most teasers, of course, we have the added gag of the backseat driver. Of course, you would think, well, Bond probably should have gotten rid of him, but of course he didn't have time to just toss the guy's body out. And of course, it gives us another moment to appreciate the beautiful pain face that Pierce Brosnan has that has become so iconic with his tenure. And while this may be a little bit on the silly side, the firing the co-pilot into the other plane, just the image is just beautiful. And of course, having to navigate two actual planes like that, one under the other, it's my favorite part of the sequence. And of course, the payoff line, with the even better payoff of Bond calling back using the code names and getting the joke in at the Admiral's expense. And I do really like the transition where the afterburner breaks the glass of the screen, and we go into Daniel Kleinman's title sequence, which would be his second for the series. I really love this title sequence. I think it's really well done and thematically fits with this sort of images behind the screen and going into, of course, the meaning behind the stories being told. Now, of course, we have to talk about the title song performed by Sheryl Crow. David Arnold did compose a song for the film, which, of course, was Surrender, performed by Katie Lang with lyrics by Don Black, which is very much a traditional style Bond song. Unfortunately, it wasn't chosen for the film, and they put it on as the end credit song, but Arnold weaves it into his entire score, so it really is thematically the song of the film. The producers sort of had a competition for who would do the title song. Many different bands and artists who were popular at the time submitted songs that were all rejected, and this Sheryl Crow song was actually submitted, and that's the one they went with. And, a lot of people have criticized this over the years. I do really like how it fits the title sequence, and I actually like it being on at the beginning, and I like Surrender being on at the end. I think it's a great placement as at the end titles. I do think the first verse of the Sheryl Crow song is a lot more tension-grabbing, which is probably why they went for it, and it has that sort of classical, for lack of a better term, spy vibe to the musicality of the song. But it works. I think the problem people have with Crow's vocal is that the film mix, it's a bit more isolated, and particularly in the choruses, it doesn't sound as good because her vocal is kind of isolated outside of the actual music track, whereas the soundtrack and single version, it's a lot more unified in the mix. Again, I have to give credit to Daniel Kleinman. He comes up with really great imagery here. So it's surprising hearing him in interviews where he says that he felt this one didn't come off as well, but I think it's brilliant. Particularly the images of the screen revealing the fully formed women, and this one here in particular, where we have the model with the diamond necklace becoming satellites, and then the light on her face becoming the sun, and her face becomes the earth itself. It's just really striking. Of course, there's the writing credit for Bruce Fierstein, who gets solo credit on the film, but of course there were a lot of other hands in the eventual screenplay. But he had the unenviable task of having to literally piece together the thing on the set itself. Now, here's my one major problem with the film that I can't stand, is Roger Spottiswood's credit is outside the title sequence, and for me, that's a major no-no. The directed by credit should always be at the very end of the title sequence. The title sequence should never cross over into the film. I don't know specifically if that was at Spottiswood's request or they did that on purpose, but it has always bugged me, and again, that's just, I know it's a minor thing, but to me, it's not a minor thing. So now we're into the main plot thrust of the film, where we have the Devonshire, and of course, this being at sea and it being a ship in danger, and we see all the blue-shirted British crewmen, you automatically think back to the opening of The Spy Who Loved Me and the capturing of the submarine. But unlike Spy, we're actually going to see the whole event taking place. We're not going to have that element of mystery left. And so at this point, like if you came into the film late, and you walked into the theater, you might think this was not a James Bond film. You might think this is just a regular thriller because we're getting a lot of plot exposition here, and it seems like a straightforward movie. This is, of course, giving us a lot of information in a very short amount of time. But it is giving us literally the entire plot thrust. And what's interesting is we're going to start having the actual machinations going on by the cutaway to our first glimpse of Henry Gupta with the tricked out GPS encoder box that we did see him purchase in the pre-title sequence. So that does directly link the pre-title sequence in with the rest of the film. And of course, this nice little cutaway to the Carver satellite behind the US-backed GPS satellite is giving us that nice visual that they're literally piggybacking off the GPS system to throw the Devonshire off course. Now we get our first glimpse of the stealth ship and the obligatory black-suited crew, and our main henchman of the film in the guise of Stamper, who unfortunately is a little underdeveloped in the final film. He's just big, blonde, and German, and it seems very much cast as a Red Grant knockoff. But originally, Stamper had this whole thing in other drafts, and it's in Benson's novelization that his pleasure and pain centers were reversed. So every time he gets hit or gets stabbed, he has that weird look on his face because he's actually feeling pleasure. So that's why he's seemingly unstoppable. And unfortunately, that's not in the film, but I think they sort of held on to that idea, and that eventually resurfaced in The World Is Not Enough in the Invulnerable to Pain Renard. Of course, we get our first very shadowy glimpse of the main villain, Carver, played by Jonathan Pryce. And now we're seeing the CVAC, which will be the main device of Carver's plan. And of course, they had to actually build the thing for real with the still teeth, which caused problems later on, and how they would shoot the actors in front of it as it was running. I mentioned before, because we're seeing all this go on, we don't get the whole mystery aspect because there is no reveal later on. It's only Bond and Wei Lin finding out what we already knew. But also, in a way, this sort of harkens back to For Your Eyes Only and the sinking of the St. George's early on in the film, which sets up the whole plot. So everybody is always quick to point out Tomorrow Never Dies is pretty much, it turns into a You Only Live Twice or Spy Who Loved Me remake, or it's sort of in that vein, particularly in the final climax, and of course the trying to instigate World War III between two world powers. But I think it's also important to note that it also borrows from For Your Eyes Only in terms of, not just that it's a British vessel at sea that gets, sunk, and then they have to go down and get information from the sunken vessel, but it becomes the major plot device of the film. So again, everyone is always quick to point out the very noticeable You Only Live Twice and Spy Who Loved Me similarities, but you also have a chunk of For Your Eyes Only in here. And of course, the fun of the sequence is the fact that nothing is as it seems, and the CVAC is not a torpedo, and that they're going to go down and steal the cruise missile, and they're just playing the British crew and the observing Chinese pilots to follow the story they're creating. And of course, there in a blink and you miss it is a pre-stardom appearance of Gerard Butler there as the other seaman. Well, this moment here also seems a bit much to me, where they sort of go for slow motion, and David Arnold sort of has a chorus effect, this very hazy shot where they're getting up very slowly, but it's over very fast. So, of course, there are one or two moments that do sort of irk me throughout the film, but they are very minor. For the most part, the thing that bugs me most is actually that director's credit being on the opening. And of course, when you think about it, this small, isolated incident, well, of course, very small, wars have been started over things even smaller than this. So the ramifications of Carver's plan are very chilling and seem perfectly believable. And what I like about the villain's plot in Tomorrow Never Dies is that it does feel like it was thought out to a point, and that he went to the point of making the deal with General Chang to get the stealth material and building a stealth boat, which was had been developed by the U.S. military at the time. So it was a U.S. Navy actual stealth ship that did actually exist, but it feels like this is in the realm of possibility. So it has a tinge of that larger-than-life Bond villain thing to it, but it doesn't go all out with it. So it feels just possible enough, which, again, the more you rewatch this, the more that plausibility does make it actually play a bit more. Of course, it is, definitely chilling, but also revealing of Stamper's pure bloodlust, that he just machine guns all the 17 survivors in cold blood. This is a really impressive shot of the divers going down, particularly when you know that it's a combination of different elements and that they had to just stitch the whole thing together. And of course, the stealing of the cruise missile here plays into the film a lot later when you realize what they're actually doing. But any sort of underwater work immediately makes you think back to Thunderball. I do like that the pacing does pick up here, and that we're not getting everything spelled out, but we're getting a lot of these little moments. We see the encoder being put away by Gupta, and now we go into this wonderful sequence where it's really the full reveal of Carver. We'd gotten the little shots before in the darkness with the one eyeglass lens poking out, but here we see Jonathan Pryce as Carver, fully lit, and he's getting to talk to his minions of his divisions. And this is where we see the full mania come out. He's holding it in, but you know he's sitting on this secret, and he's just about to explode. And of course, got to point it out, the man on the screen here, Mr. Wallace, is of course producer Michael G. Wilson making his typical cameo. And I love the inherent humor about all of these. Blackmailing the president, releasing the software full of bugs, all these things to increase Carver's control over the world, literally, not just make himself richer. And of course, this is not being done as a standard conference, much like the one we saw in the Russian government in GoldenEye, but Carver being obsessed with technology, it's of course done by video. And honestly, the more I've watched this film, the more I've become accustomed to it. Carver really is an underrated villain, and I love what Jonathan Pryce does with it. He does a lot of these little. He brings so many little mannerisms in, but he has a charge to his performance. Particularly, you see that this gleam in his eyes, and here you can hear it in his voice, where he rises in pitch and he builds, and he's almost yelling by the end, and then he trails off, and of course we go in for a slightly tighter shot where he has a very very ominous one-liner. There's no news like bad news, but he's having fun with it, and he's really giving the hints of mania that are in Carver. I think it's unfortunate we didn't really get the full extent of the character's backstory, because of course Carver was orphaned and was the illegitimate son of a rich British news tycoon who was tied into British politics, and then basically Carver finds out his true parentage and blackmails his biological father into suicide and steals his empire and builds it up from there. So he's like always gets something to prove against the world, and that's what drives him. Unfortunately, we don't get all of that in the film, which I think is fascinating stuff. So now we have our introduction to Bond, sort of reworking the traditional style tryst. Of course, it's not with Sylvia Trench as the series started out with. But the whole thing with the learning Danish actually did play into some of the drafts, and it's in Benson's novelization where Wayland happens to mention that she knows some Danish, and so they actually use that in the stealth boat where Bond actually says something in Danish that he knows only Wayland will get. I wish that was in the film, and that was a sort of payoff for this scene. But unfortunately, it's just a sort of wink at the audience. Of course, Bond has a beautiful blonde in bed, and that's why he hasn't seen the news. And it gives Moneypenny a chance to be at her cunning linguist best. And we get the beautiful exchange, don't ask, don't tell. That for me is the great cap to the scene. And then of course we get the visual of Bond driving in the DB5, and David Arnold knows to go right for the James Bond theme, and he'll do that throughout the score in the big moments and in particular Bondian moments. And I'm sure there was a directive after the experience with Sarah on GoldenEye to go for the James Bond theme whenever and wherever possible as being important to make a Bond score full of the iconic sound again. So again, here with M and Roebuck going back and forth, we have this sort of political infighting between the departments, and it's nice that M is holding back information, because as she says in the debriefing scene right after this, she already MI6 already knows that the signal was traced to Carver in Hamburg, and she knows that just saying that would cause a political firestorm, so she has to tread carefully, even though they're on the brink of perhaps World War III. So it's suggesting that MI6 does have to play their cards close to the vest, not just at this time, but at other times as well. And I like that they're talking about all this stuff, and even though Bond is late, he comes in and he's grabbed a copy of Tomorrow, which has the brand new news that even the government doesn't have. So one of the few flaws in Carver's plan I've always felt is like he should have waited just a little bit longer to get the news out, because how could they possibly have gotten the news before even governmental informants got the news? How could they excuse away that they knew 17 British soldiers had been murdered before even the Vietnamese government did? And I like that Bond has picked up on this, and that he feels that this is too suspicious, as he says here in the traditional M's office scene, which has been moved to this fast-traveling car. I like that it gives Bond that character moment. I like that Brosnan really, plays it, and I like that Judi Dench's M. You can see in her face she knows her best agent's instincts are worth following and listening. And of course, that's already where they were headed, because they had traced the signal to Carver's offices in Hamburg. And of course, right there's another "You Only Live Twice" nod, because of course, "You Only Live Twice," the plot is instigated by following the intruder missile and surmising that it landed in Japan, which is why Bond goes to Japan. Some people have complained that this sequence is a little weird, but they did have to cut around how they originally shot it. You do see some glimpses, like you see M holding a glass in some of the shots. Originally, they were drinking, and they had to hold their drinks, keep them from spilling while they were turning around corners and stuff. And apparently, MGM and some other people didn't like that, so they had to cut around as much as possible. That's why all the shots are tight. You see even Robinson's holding a glass in some of the shots. But that's why all the shots are really tight, and they're sort of cutting around that. You can see the full shot sequence on the DVD and Blu-ray extras, but that's why it looks a little strange. But the whole thing was to change up the traditional briefing scene in M's office, which is something in every Bond film, really since GoldenEye, they try to shy away from. In GoldenEye, the traditional office scene, it takes place much later in the film. It takes a while to get to it. Here, they do it in a car. The placement's a little weird, and the world is not enough. It's something they don't like having a traditional office briefing scene, getting the mission details at the beginning of the film, and I don't know why, but it's something they always want to change up or move or play around with. Now we have Bond in Germany. I like that they have Bond speaking a little bit of German, giving a hint of that worldliness, and we have Q in the field once more, looking a bit odd and out of place in a red Avis jacket, but it does give us this wonderful banter about the rental car insurance policy. And it seems, tailor-made for the traditional Q and Bond banter. Now, apparently Desmond Llewellyn had been asking to get a sort of exit scene for his character of Q to be written into the films for some time. That was built into the earlier drafts of this film with a substitute Q character, but eventually they dropped that and, of course, worked it into The World's Not Enough. Now, in the background, you see there another crate with a cage in it that actually holds a Jaguar. Unfortunately, that was a joke cut from the film where Q opens the first cage and the Jaguar's there, and Bond makes some sort of quip, it's like, and Q's just like, wrong assignment. I wish they kept that in. It's a very quick gag, and so if you ever wondered why there's just a Jaguar sitting in a cage in the back, I don't know. It's just the idea of that there had to be some assignment where they needed a Jaguar for an MI6 agent. just the bizarre fact of that as an idea, I just find so appealing. And Q having to worry about that, I don't know. I just find it so interesting, and I wish they kept that gag in the film. But of course, here we get introduced to the BMW 750iL and the iconic remote control phone. That, of course, has to get set up here so we will know how Bond will use it in the car park chase. And of course, the key to any Bond gadget is you have to establish it first. This goes back to the precedent set on Goldfinger with the DB5's ejector seat. Perhaps maybe again going back to the sort of video game Bond idea. Bond, of course, is already adept with being able to do fancy and flashy driving with the cell phone touchpad, much to Q's bewilderment. Brosnan's playing of this is beautiful. It's exactly the right note and provides one of the iconic Q lines, grow up 007. I do really like the transitional moments in Arnold's score. This is a nice little bit of background music as we go over the night skyline and into the CMGN gala. I like Bond gets to, again, use a little German and make fun of the driver assist female voice that Q has put into the BMW. Now, I do like the look they achieved here with the party set. Again, they've added these laser lights to give it a sort of edge with the neon blue lighting and things. Again, you can see the difference in the actual the lensing and then the lighting. It still has this different look to it compared to GoldenEye, but it has a gloss of its own. It's got a visual identity, and this becomes perhaps Brosnan's most polished James Bond. Get a nice slight push in on the camera, and he's undercover as a banker. And I like how Carver has no real reaction, but he's cavorting around with his, hangers on, and before Bond can even establish the villain Bond repartee, Carver's already distracted by the first appearance of Wei Lin, who sort of comes into the film at this point. And of course, we don't know that she's the Chinese equivalent of Bond right now, but you can already tell from Michelle Yeoh's stature and the way she carries herself that that's where this is going to go. While this is going on, Bond gets his first glimpse of Paris. And what's interesting to note, in some of the other drafts, and again in Benson's screenplay, the whole Bond Paris thing actually takes place with Carver there, and she literally, they don't even have any dialogue, she just slaps him right in front of her husband and stuff. So they do it a little bit differently here, and we get, definitely more of their backstory. There is more dialogue. Now, the idea of Bond encountering an old flame is something that is striving to get more meat on the bone story-wise and dramatically in the traditional Bond girl context. Growing up with this film, I kind of cringed at this whole idea because it never quite worked. It just always feels kind of forced. Unfortunately, Terry Hatcher as Paris Carver isn't given a whole lot to do. And, outside of this initial meeting and the sort of angst she has and the pent up anger and stuff, that frustration at Bond Bond leaving her, outside of that, it just kind of goes nowhere. But this gives the little bit for Gupta to record that will, supposedly reveal Carver's wife's treachery to him later on. But I like that the idea that he's just sitting in the background and just has to compulsively monitor everyone. And of course, Carver is already pathologically jealous and noticing that something is up. But I do like that Bond is actually going against M's orders, and the most obvious route to get information out of Carver, that he is choosing to not use his prior history with Paris, and literally spells out, that's not my plan. And of course, the irony of Carver eventually getting rid of his wife is that Paris had decided to stay with him and not betray him. And until he goes after Bond, and we have the whole aftermath of this conference evening. Only after she reunites with Bond, after her husband sends her after him and kind of freaked her out, that she gives Bond necessary information. But she still chooses to go back to her husband, and of course he's decided to kill her without knowing that she stuck up for him. I do really liked all of the multi-layered dialogue here, particularly between Bond and Carver. Bond sort of poking at his front, all of the dialogue about sending a ship off course. Oh, I've been lost at sea. Manipulating the course of governments. And it's all in the performance, and you can see how Bond is getting to Carver. Carver's keeping up the false front, and knowing that Bond is obviously not what he seems, but he can't prove it. And of course, Bond not giving any ground, but taking ground. And then the nice moment where he looks over at Paris, keeps his eyes locked on her, and then turns the Carver to sort of bore it into him. So there are nice little moments like that scattered throughout the film that really have some weight to them. Now this allows Bond and Wei Lin to meet properly, and now we get this nice little bit, "You're a terrible liar, dear. I have a problem with a banker." I like these little bits because it gives Carver some humanity, and you get a little bit more in the villain's head. I appreciate little transitional moments like that, and bits like that, and like this here where Wei Lin and Bond get to share the lines about their respective covers, and obviously knowing that each other is up to no good, and recognizing their that they're basically opposite numbers. It's little transitional moments like this that you lose over the course of shifting trends in filmmaking, with the general desire to rush to the end to keep the runtimes down, which is, of course, ironic because Tomorrow Never Dies does have a short runtime and does feature a greater percentage of action scenes, but they still make time for little breathing moments, little bits of character, nice silent reaction shots. Of course, Bond getting the story. Oh, you have an urgent phone call, and he just nods, and you see Brosnan taking this in, and it's like, yeah, obviously it's not a phone call. Bond obviously knows where this is headed. Not that he's immediately going to get jumped in the recording booth, but that obviously this is something Carver's cooked up. And of course, Carver in his speech is painting himself as some great philanthropist, and the dialogue and the nice sort of angelic lighting that comes down on him, you can get all of these complexes rolled into one. But he also has his goals plainly laid out. That's why we have the cutaways. What am I after? Power. And he goes on, oh, the power to do this and the power to help, blah, 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 blah. But it's like, yes, we know. We can see exactly. That's really not your goal at all. And we get this nice added bit here that Stamper decides to stay and watch his idol's speech first before going to attend to Bond. And, of course, that proves to not help Carver out in the slightest. And then the gag of this fight is, of course, it's a soundproof recording studio. So the poor fellow who's just minding his own business behind the glass has no idea of the fight that's going on until Goon's body comes hurtling through the glass. And we get these nice cutaways from the fight to the side room where the sound will drop out, and we go back and forth. Right there. What do I expect? Worldwide domination. He's subtle, isn't he? I especially love this moment where Bond picks up the glass ashtray, he checks the weight, and he takes a moment, and only then does he bash the guy with it. And he's been roughed up a little bit, and then he gets to take in more of Carver's egotism before settling on the power panel and then deciding to get his own in with time for a station break. And then he waits that extra second to give it that dramatic moment to cut the power, just to stick the knife in a little bit further. So it's the classical Bond's, literally poking at the villain and trying to provoke that reaction, which is how any Bond and villain first confrontation needs to go. You have to have that. We get a little bit of Carver losing his cool. He immediately fires his PR lady. Get a nice lingering moment of Stamper surveying the damage, coming in, looking at the broken glass. And of course, I love the fact that they obviously know that Bond did this, so now Bond is going to have to wait. And we get this scene here where he is in a moment straight out of Dr. No. This has been cooked up to invoke Bond waiting for Professor Dent in Mrs. Taro's cottage. We even have him screwing on the silencer. He's down to his shirt. The top buttons are undone. He's waiting there, and he's just taking shots out of the Smirnoff bottle, waiting for the goon or whoever's going to show up. And, of course, it will be Paris and the reveal. But we get the cut back to this scene where you see how Paris's marriage has not gone very well. You get a little flash of Carver's backstory here, and it's really fascinating, but it's really our only glimpse into his backstory. He talks about his early days in being a newspaper man, and the lines about, the key to any great story is not who, not how, but why. And then he ties that into, I want to know why Mr. Bond did all this, and I know you're lying, so you're going to get this information from me because you're going to be my tool. And while the waiter goes around in the background, I have to point out and mention, should have earlier, I love the gag idea that all of the waiters in the party scene, their jackets were, of course, made of newspaper print. And Carver's confrontation here, there's something very chilling and very cold about it, particularly when he actually embraces her and kisses her. We pull out to a wide shot, and with Arnold's music cue, it's very chilling in a way. Can we go to this wide shot here? So there's something very wrong about that. So now we cut back to Bond, and you see him look at his watch. The lighting's changed a little bit. He hears a noise. Hand laid down on the gun. Then he sees it's Paris. And, of course, he's got the connecting doors open, so he can obviously see whoever comes in through the door. So now the texture of the scene changes because, of course, it is not an assassin, but this is the means of which Carver has decided to get information. He saw Bond's obvious connection to his wife, so he decided to send his wife instead of the goon squad. So, of course, Bond fans are set up and primed for a Dr. No-style scene, but instead we're getting the sort of, for lack of a better term, the attempt at trying to break the formula here. This is the supposed payoff of the Paris character being the former flame of Bond, and sort of, I don't have a problem with the idea. It's just the execution's always kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. The lines back and forth about, did I get too close for comfort? That Paris became too much of an attachment for Bond, and that he, had to distance himself somehow from her, and that his lifestyle wouldn't, allow for an actual love interest, which he has had in the past and did have once or twice in the novels, particularly with, of course, Tracy and OHMSS and Tiffany Case in Diamonds Are Forever. But this scene now, it plays better than you remember it. And the actor, Brosnan and Terry Hatcher are doing the best they can with the material. It requires more, and unfortunately after this, Paris doesn't do anything other than unfortunately get eliminated, and she becomes the sacrificial lamb of the film. I do like that they hint here at the repressed passion that they have for one another. This pause where Bond then slides off her dress, and we get the very nice looking reveal from the master shot. That's very dramatic. But then when they embrace again, they suggest this sort of repressed passion through the years, and they sort of throw themselves into the close-ups. Particularly, I really like the last line of Paris, the little "I missed you" at the very tail end of the scene, almost because she's whispering it in his ear. I like that touch; gives it a nice personal feel. Again, it's just something I wish they had been able to finesse more, because I think with the Paris character, you really need more material other than like, oh, here's my former flame, oh, we're gonna sort of get back together, and then, oh no, she's gone now. I like Gupta's explanation. He's able to put together that Bond is a government agent because all of a sudden he's appeared, he's a banker, he has a perfect record, so he must be a government agent. And then he gives Carver the stare when he says, "I think my wife knows him." And then he just plays back the one clip he has of, "Tell me, James, do you still sleep with a gun under your pillow?" And then you see Carver's eyes go cold, and he has him play it again and on a loop over and over and over. And immediately, "We're going to call the doctor now." And Paris Carver is not long for this world. Gupta just nods and is like, "All right, boss, I'm getting out of the way." And then he moves closer and he rewatches the video footage over and over and over again as an observer. Again, nice, very cold touch as well. And now we cut back to the obvious post-love scene, and it's the early hours of the morning. I really like this part of the scene where she's obviously terrified of her husband, but she's going back to him, and Bond still says, you do have a choice. But she insists on going back anyway, but still has a loyalty to Bond and tells him the best means of infiltration. And Bond says, "You don't have to do this," and she does it anyway. Like, she insists on it. So there's an interesting dichotomy in the character. And again, I just wish this had been finessed out more, because there is potential here. And I think what always made me cringe a little bit beforehand is just feels kind of on the nose, because all we get is this one scene and then it's over, and then it's like, okay, got to move along. Here is probably my favorite transitional moment in the film. Carver is sitting here all alone, rubbing his hands a little bit. You may question, is he thinking about he's had his wife murdered, or he's thinking about his oncoming plan? He's stepping up his timetables, as he says later on. I think you get a combination of all those things, but it's a nice little tiny moment where he's just sitting there in the dark of a new day in the middle of his great empire, and just stewing over his genius and how he will update his plan. This is one of my favorite moments in Arnold's score, the what's titled Hamburg Break-In and Break-Out, the two different cues when Bond infiltrates and then exits the Carver facility once he's discovered. Of course, using the Q phone with the lock-picking antenna. This whole sequence, it's very small here. Everybody thinks about the action breakout, but I love Bond infiltrating here because he's obviously doing actual spying work. And we get the nice gag setup of Gupta coming out, and the funny idea that he hates traveling, and that you have this henchman who has perfectly human quirks, and setting up this satellite as being ridiculously expensive, and don't break it whatever you do. So of course the first thing Bond does when he's discovered is just smash it into smithereens. But what I really love here is Bond breaking into Gupta's office, which again harkens back to Gumbold's office in OHMSS. But he literally just fries the control lock and breaks in to find the GPS decoder box. But I love this sequence here. It's showing Bond search the whole office, but it's cut to time, and it's a montage. But I think it's very effective. It makes me think of the sort of montage search that we see Marlowe do in the Hawks version of The Big Sleep, where Bogart goes through the house, and then Bond finds the safe by, actually using his wits. And I love David Arnold's cue here. Yeah, it's definitely a little on the techno side, but again, it's more of Arnold sort of following his own muse, and I really like that. I just love the way it fits into this whole sequence. And we see Bond using his actual wits and doing actual spycraft, search in the office, finding the encoder box. We see all of this stuff that Gupta has here. What does he have? Obviously, drugs, porno magazines, stacks of cash, and the red box with the GPS encoder. So it's like, well, I guess you can use a safe for other items as well, that you don't want the boss to discover. And of course, at this point, Bond has achieved his goal and should just leave. But Wei Lin has decided to break in and unfortunately set off all the alarms. And the fun of the gag is that she gets introduced at gunpoint, Bond gets a one-liner in, and then immediately that's it. And here's the gag with the satellite. So, millions of dollars down the drain. And this is the fun gag. Bond breaks through, alarm goes off again, and I like that Brosnan lets out like a little tiny, I'm not for sure, but it's almost like he says Christ as a sort of, oh, damn. And this whole sequence is like everything that Bond tries to do, there's more guards. Every time he thinks he's escaped, there's another layer of guards. And then he sees Wei Lin just be able to almost essentially walk out the back door by using her rappelling down the wall. Then we get this nice little moment. She sort of salutes, and he's just like, ah. He's like, thanks for getting me into this mess. Again, it's amazing to see how many layers of security Carver has. Of course, this whole sequence was shot over multiple locations, but it does give you a greater idea of Carver's empire. Now we're, of course, in the news printing section over actual, in an actual newspaper printing warehouse facility over real papers being printed. So this was, very, very precarious because that is, those are real, newspaper pressing machines, which of course obviously means that one of the henchmen have to get thrown in there and there has to be bloody newsprint. And of course, with the one-liner giving the nice payoff, that would normally be the end of the action sequence. But again, what's interesting here, we go from this, now we're in the part where we have the paper rolls that are these massive, bits of tonnage. We have a nice bit of the Bond theme, so we think Bond's going to make a cool exit, but then we get almost a jump scare of sorts when the bullet goes off just behind Bond and breaks the glass. We then realize the action sequence is definitely not over. And then we get what I think is probably the most inspired, fantastical part where Bond jumps on the little rolly cart. And then we get a full Bond fanfare theme. And the nice roll off, ducking around the forklift, which again makes you think you'll live twice. And then rolling under the garage door to then very calmly trying to look cool and get in the BMW parked in just the right place. I really like this bit here where, again, how Carver gets Bond's phone number, I don't exactly know, but I like that he directly calls him, and then two items that belong to me, the red box and my wife in your hotel room. So not only does he, be like, I know what you just did, I have your phone number, and then immediately, Bond is like, oh crap, Paris is in my hotel room. And he knows that something has happened, and then you see him just hang up, and you see the BMW roar as he's stomped on the gas. Then we see Stamper in the reveal, so we know that obviously this is a setup, which of course it is. But Bond is still preparing by locking away the encoder box in the essentially the vault of the BMW 750. We see the fingerprint ID lock, getting a fresh PPK, and then arming the BMW with a security level. You can see the sort of brewing anger and the trepidation in Brosnan's walk, even because, of course, he doesn't know what he's walking into, and Carver's essentially made a threat already by saying, my wife's in your hotel room. And of course, we see the goon squad pulling up, which leads to all the fun gags of their being unable to break into the BMW. Of course, in any sort of spy thriller, an open door brings so many bad omens. And already we hear the news story coming in, so already we know that something is up. And I like the idea that we're hearing the news that has not yet happened, again alluding to the fact that Carver is manipulating the news, and the saying, as we hear in the film a few times, tomorrow's news today. Of course, the film was originally titled Tomorrow Never Lies, which fits the film's plot. The title was changed after a typo, and MGM liked the typo, but I must admit I have always liked Tomorrow Never Dies as a title. I don't mind that it was changed. Now, this is the Dr. Kaufman scene. Paris is the sacrificial lamb and has ostensibly been killed by this truly interesting character that really is a movie in and of himself. And of course, Dr. Kaufman was at one point, apparently it was considered to do a sort of prequel film to this moment and build a whole movie out of this character, just as it was to do a Wei Lin film spinoff. None of these came to pass, but Vincent Schiavelli does a really incredible job in this one little scene at making this character idea come to life. And I love this idea of this professional killer for hire who can make any death seem accidental. And so obviously he gets paid the big bucks by all of these extremely rich people who have people they need out of the way. And then I love the line, "I'm especially good at the celebrity overdose." So yeah, it's a fascinating character. Totally makes sense that they considered making a movie out of him, because you easily could. Apparently, from what I read in the Nobody Does It Better oral history book, some of the guys at MGM said this whole scene and the Kaufman character was the major contribution of the writer Dan Petrie. So this is where you see his fingerprints on the story, and this is what his contribution that stayed. Was the Dr. Kaufman scene, and it does seem like almost out of another movie. It's this great scene sandwiched in here. And the real payoff for me is we get this very chilling talk, and he's this interesting character, and Bond is staring into his own death. How's he going to get out of this? Very much for Russia with Love like. And then all of a sudden, the earpiece goes off really loud, which, of course, anyone who's ever had a walkie-talkie earpiece on and somebody comes over really loud, it really hurts. And then the gag of being unable to get in the car, and then Kaufman being embarrassed that he has to ask Bond to open his own car because they can't break in. There's just something so wonderfully amusing in a very morbid way about this, and I adore it. And that allows Kaufman to go into his whole spiel about, I am to touch you if you don't do it, and that sets up the chakra torture stuff that comes later on, and then gives the lines about Kaufman being sort of alternate father figure to Stamper, and so that's why Stamper looks all emotional when he sees Bond come out of the room, because Dr. Kaufman's obviously no longer alive, and so we don't really know why that is at first, but that's the setup for the chakra torture later on. And it does give Brosnan this great moment where he's able to exact revenge for Paris and actually give us the scene we thought we were going to get with the whole reference to Dr. No earlier on, because here he's killing Kaufman in cold blood, just as Bond does with Professor Dent. So again, a little bit delayed maybe from when we first see a Bond with silenced pistol and vodka, waiting for the Carver representative to show up. But there he kills Kaufman in cold blood. And then I like that he takes the time and then he kisses Paris's corpse. It's a very striking moment. We get a little hint of that again, and The World's Not Enough when once Bond kills Elektra at the climax of the film. And again, I think you can see some echoes of the whole Paris scene there show up in The World's Not Enough, which seems completely trying to form itself around the idea of trying to break out of the supposed constraints of the Bond formula. So now we go into the iconic car chase sequence, which of course never leaves the parking garage. And on the soundtrack, we get the track Backseat Driver, which is the collaboration between David Arnold and the Propellerheads, who had both worked successfully together on Arnold's Shaken and Stirred concept album, which is probably the sort of, proof that MGM had that Arnold was the best choice for new Bond composer. Now, of course, as I said before, going into the film, the car chase was really one of the few pieces they had to start with. They really just had the set pieces of, again, the pre-title sequence, the Devonshire sinking, this, and the bike chase. And then everything else had to be built up or finessed or reworked from Fierstein's original first script draft. So all the action sequences are, very long, are full of a lot of different ideas, were very well storyboarded, beautifully put together, but that's literally what they started out with. That's all they had, and they had to sort of build from around them. So that's why they're such highlights, I think, is because that's literally what they started with. What's great about this sequence is you have the novelty of Bond being in the back seat, so you have a driverless car chase, and they stay in the confines of the parking garage. So Bond will get all the way to the bottom and then have to go all the way back up to the top. What's interesting, though, is, for having all these rockets, it's interesting that Q's rocketry can't bust through a garage door, but I guess maybe it's steel lined or something. I don't know, but I've always thought that's kind of odd that Q Branch's rockets can't break through a parking garage door. And right there on the score, you can hear the theme of Surrender, the end title song, worked in. Again, David Arnold does that a number of times throughout his score, and that's why Surrender was, obviously intended as the opening title song. It's really fun to see Brosnan's joy of performance and all the little bits where Bond gets to smile and enjoy his one-upmanship. Another little moment I like, once the rocket goes through the windshield and the guy with the rocket launcher is about to be hit, he does this little cartwheel off to the side. It's just a little gag I've always enjoyed. And now the bit with the tow truck. We did see the tow truck earlier, so it's not just there. But of course, pulling the line taut, Bond is able to see the tow truck but not realize the actual danger until, getting close to it. But of course, since he's seen the tow truck, he can get an idea of what they're trying to do. But here, having the actual BMW logo be a gadget is cool. But of course, that being absolutely necessary in the middle of a chase, yeah, it's definitely a little coincidental, but it's a fun moment nonetheless. And it does give Bond a chance to get out ahead enough to allow the villains to not see him jump out of the car. And I really love Brosnan's performance once he gets out of the car, because this has got to be the most difficult thing to do, because you're just staring into a cell phone and having to sell the performance as if you're still in the car itself. And once he crashes the car through, when he raises a hand up in salute and has that look on his face, that look of, it's right there, that to me is the best part of the whole sequence. And of course, there just happens to be an Avis rent-a-car location that he's crashed it into. Thankfully, there was no one in there. And then he has a little chuckle as he gets up. Then he smooths himself out and looks around as if to see that anybody's noticed him having a little moment of childish fun. I love that payoff to the ending of the sequence. But it does feel a little bit weird when you think about it, because it comes right after Bond having this emotional moment, finding Paris's cold body and killing Dr. Kaufman and stuff. It does allow the audience to take a breather after that and have some fun. But it's like, you would think Bond wouldn't be smiling so fast after that. But again, outside of a cursory mention with the next Carver confrontation scene, Paris is never mentioned again. So it's like, I guess her death wasn't really that impactful for Bond, maybe. So, of course, this scene has to give us some plot exposition about how the GPS device was tampered with. We get a reappearance of Joe Don Baker as Jack Wade, of course, interestingly, in a Hawaiian shirt. So that gives us a nice little nod to GoldenEye without being, too on the nose or obvious. We get to see Bond in his naval uniform for the first time since The Spy Who Loved Me, and unfortunately, this is pretty much the last time we see it, at least up till now. And of course, gives us another linkage to the plot structure being similar to both You Only Live Twice and The Spy Who Loved Me. So it's rather interesting that all three films are very similar in plot and story, and the locale is similar to You Only Live Twice in ways, and in all three films we see Bond in his naval uniform, and that's the only time we see him in his naval uniform. I do like the gag about there having to be all the security for, actually bringing out the GPS system, and then Bond just casually has the other one. They freak out. And of course, that location was supposed to be roughly Okinawa, but it was shot in England, just as the interior of this plane was actually shot on stage. And just like on GoldenEye, they wound up having to essentially construct their own studio facilities, but they still couldn't even use the Leavesden studio they constructed on GoldenEye. So they wound up all the studio interiors they had to convert an old a grocery warehouse of some type in England into studio spaces, and then use the adjoining parking garage, and that's where they did the car chase. And Bond actually doing a halo jump, at this point in time, it's, again, using real-world techniques, and this was an incredibly difficult sequence to film. And of course, a halo jump is the really like the last-ditch attempt. Like you do everything else, a halo jump is the last option because the risk of fatality is so high. And again, to mention Mission Impossible, they have now since done a Halo sequence in one of the later sequels, and of course you can't help but think, okay, yeah, Bond did that 20 years before. This is still a really well done sequence, especially considering at the time, with CG still being in its relative infancy, you couldn't use that to patch in a lot of stuff. And of course, they did go back to a lot of the traditional aerial team that had been working on the series all the way back, starting on Moonraker. So that scene also is Jack Wade's exit from the film, pretty much, and Jack Wade's exit as a character from the series, because that's his last appearance. Again, this is another scene where the sound design really helps and adds another dimension to the story, because, of course, it's a totally different sound environment with Bond in the free fall part above the clouds. And then we get this nice moment once he goes through the clouds and then breaks through, and we finally see the glimpse of the water. It's a nice little transitional moment because all of a sudden the sound drops down quite a bit. And then we have to do the parachute deployment right as Bond's body hits the water. And now diving down to the sunken Devonshire wreck, again, it makes you think to For Your Eyes Only, but it also makes you think to Thunderball. And, of course, Bond diving down and finding the wreck of the Vulcan bomber. So it's impossible not to have Bond illusions, even if they're unintentional, by the time you get to the 18th film in the series. And, of course, swimming through and seeing the corpses again makes you think of For Your Eyes Only when we go inside the sunken St. George's. And setting up that the Devonshire is in a very precarious position, so obviously it would be wise to not hang around very long. This is another point where Benson's novelization does kind of hammer home more of the practicalities, because he goes into detail about how obviously Bond's air supply would be very limited at this point after doing a halo jump, and then due to the depth, when they go to the surface later on, he has Bond and Waylon have to go up in stages to avoid getting the bends and having to share a regulator and stuff. So there are a couple moments in the novelization where Benson has the time and injects a little bit more of a real world context to a few scenes. So now Waylon re-enters the film, and we get this bit of confusion underwater where, of course, it is very difficult to establish someone's identity as soon as they appear. And I like that they have this moment where they are obviously trying to communicate, and it takes them a second to realize who the other person is. But then that's interrupted by the fact that obviously they've picked the wrong time to go inside the Devonshire wreck. And almost as in a nod to GoldenEye, now all the shelves collapse and lock them inside the missile room. But we've established that one cruise missile has been stolen. You can see the actual cutting marks from the welding torch we saw earlier from Carver's divers. So that's, of course, going to play into the climax where Carver has the stolen British cruise missile he's going to fire into Beijing. It's also really interesting that you actually see the actors doing the underwater diving for real. You see their faces, and also that this is a real underwater set that is fully enclosed, which is very daunting to any diver, and of course, especially to actors. And of course, they did have to have their scuba certification before doing this stuff, but it really helps sell the sequence. And there is important information going on here. It's not just, for show and just a transitional piece. I like this little reprise of the banking biplate that they have here once they break the surface. It's that playful aspect of the Bond-Whelan relationship that I find the most rewarding and the most suggestive that they would have an actual romantic relationship. And unfortunately, we don't get enough of that in the film. So eventually, they're getting together for the closeout clinch of the film. These traditional Bond closeout or final fade out with the leading lady of the film. It feels a little bit forced because we don't have enough of that development. We get the sense of mutual respect they have that's built up, and their eventual linking up, but that whole romantic part feels very forced. I just think it needed more of that laid out over the course of the film. And really, I think Benson's novelization, the thing I like most about it is the extra character beats that he gives Wei Lin. Again, I don't know if all of that was maybe in some of the additional drafts that just are not available online to peruse through, but I like what he gave Wei Lin in terms of character. It's some extra beats here and there, and there is some romance before they get on the stealth boat, which I think helps the final fade-out clinch feel. It gives it a little bit more believability, and he weaves in the budding romance a bit more, which I think the film doesn't do as much. There we saw a little glimpse of the great Philip Kwok, who is legendary for his work in Hong Kong films, just like Michelle Yeoh was at this time. It's unfortunate that that's his only real thing to do in the film, and he doesn't have anything else to do because, of course, had you seen him in John Woo's masterful Hard Boiled, you'd expect him to be doing amazing action sequences. Now, this is the next Carver confrontation in this really lovely designed main HQ room of Carver's Saigon headquarters, which actually is a redress of the Hamburg headquarters, which is actually a redress of the MI6 Situation Room. So it's actually doing triple duty, rather interestingly. And I mean, you wouldn't really know it had you, known it. But I think it's really impressive they were able to do that with this single set. I love Carver's dialogue here and the way that Price plays it. I mean, he has real gems of lines here. And of course, we get the whole launching point for this entire film, words of the new weapons, satellites of the new artillery. Well, that is right here. But the particular line that I find the most quotable is Carver's reply to Bond when Bond tries to provoke him once more. You know, the distance between insanity and genius is measured only by success. I mean, that that is genius. And it's all in the way that Price sells it. I mean, you could just see the venom in his eyes, just this, and then Bond is able to provoke him into almost ranting at places, and he's getting excited by his own genius. And it's little moments like that that I can't help but find, quote, delicious. And I love that little joke at God's own expense. It's just, there's a richness in Carver that I think just comes out over repeat viewings over time. And in a lot of ways, even though he's not a physical threat to Bond, he's not the Bond villain that can go toe to toe in a physical fistfight. That's why he needs Stamper and his entire organization. He has to have the muscle bound villain. In spite of that, I think he may be the most rewarding villain of the four Brosnan films. There's just something in the way that Price's performance and some of the witty lines that Carver has, that there's an energy there. Whereas Sean Bean as Trevelyan had this nice coldness and all the great lines about the being in the post-Cold War period. There's just something about that look in Carver's eyes that Jonathan Pryce gives it that also means Bond has to come up with something more than his traditional one-liners, because here the one-liners are barbed. And of course, that's perfect with the very barbed, nasty-looking chakra torture instruments. And so Carver has great relish when he has the line about "save this one for last," so Bond can watch his own heart stop beating. And then Bond immediately uses his sort of, as Carver says, old-fashioned ways to immediately improvise a means of getting out and literally, blasting the whole HQ room to hell and back. And, of course, establishing the idea again that Bond is now handcuffed to Wei Lin. So adding a nice complication onto the scene, and, of course, a very Hitchcockian one, because the idea of the hero and heroine of the film being handcuffed together, of course, goes all the way back, really, to Hitchcock's masterpiece, The 39 Steps. And here we have another one of the iconic visuals of the film where they use the banner to rappel down the side of the film and slow their descent, and it rips directly through Carver's face. So it's a visual representation of Bond literally cutting through the villain's pomposity and his ego in a physical, visible way, while also hearkening back and referencing classic cinema with, pirate films and Douglas Fairbanks and Crimson Pirate and things like that, and using the sword to rip through the sail. And then actually a really nicely played bit of comedy here, not overdone, where they have to look cool bursting through into an office. Now, this was a brilliant move on Roger Spottiswood's part. He basically pulled a sort of Hitchcockian trick. He told each actor, he told Pierce Brosnan and he told Michelle Yeoh separately when they were shooting this, to each go to get on the bike at first, and then just shot it with each one having conflicting directions. And that's the take you see in the film. And also there in the long shot, if you can blink and miss it, but you see the ripped Carver banner right there, which is a nice touch. Now, this bit of Bond and Wei Lin having to fight over driving the bike in the middle of starting another chase sequence adds this particular extra level. And then when they're squabbling, and then she finally says, "Who's driving?" and David Arnold chooses that moment to bring in the Bond theme on guitar, played with this slight slyness to it. it's a moment of the sublime. It really is. And while this is a nicely put together chase, it's that element of adding conflict, of handcuffing Bond and Wayland together and forcing them to work together, whereas before this point they had been, actively working at opposite ends. This is the point where they're forced to be coupled and finally see up close the positive attributes of the other. And of course, there's always time for a line or two at Bond's expense. And over the course of the chase, we're given time for both Bond and Wayland to pull off tricks to successfully thwart their pursuers and once again impress the other with their abilities. And the other interesting thing about the sequence is, this is a quite large BMW bike. It is a very heavy bike, which means it's not the easiest thing to have two people on or wheelie, as we see here, or, drive through the packed city streets. It should also be mentioned that, of course, this is not actually Saigon, where they originally had scheduled to film. They had to move it at the last minute after permissions were suddenly pulled and basically run and gun and do the whole thing in Thailand. And it's really done beautifully well, and they probably should have gone to Thailand in the first place. And what's amazing about the production design in this particular sequence is the matching between the location footage and the set footage, the whole little street set they designed that's primarily shown in the end part of this sequence with the helicopter's destruction. It's perfectly seamless. I mean, it doesn't even look like there's set footage at all. It looks like it's all completely location. So it's absolutely seamless and brilliantly put together. And you can just see it how much they were allowed to just literally blow this rooftop section to pieces with all of the preset bullet hits. So this is building up to the incredible bike jump, which is all the more amazing because, again, it is done completely for real. What's also really incredible is no one believed that the stunt driver could actually make the jump, and he's like, oh, no, I can do it. And he literally pulled it off. They do have multiple cameras on the sequence, so it is good that they have the build-up. Build-up for any action sequence is necessary. We get a little blast of Bond fanfare, builds up the drama of the sequence, and then the score kind of drops out and gives this little windmilling effect. But you do have that cross-cutting in the different camera setups that, to me, kind of undercuts the jump. I wish they would have just kept it as a single take, but that obviously would have been maybe a bit too short to take it all in. It's a little silly that they crash into the bedroom with the couple making love, but I like the gag that the woman just looks and they're like, holy crap, a motorcycle just collapsed in here, and they just drive off. And then she just looks and they're like, oh, well, and they just keep going at it. It's just a particular gag I've always liked. And now we get more product placement. Of course, it's a little strange that there's an entire Heineken beer truck dropping off beer in the middle of the street. But, you have to get the product placement in, and at least it's, blink and you miss it. Of course, Bond is on a BMW motorcycle because BMW was the vehicle sponsor of the film. And since they had already provided 17 BMW 750s for the car chase, it's, of course, applicable that Bond would be on a BMW bike that just happened to be sitting outside Carver's HQ. Now, the bit here with the helicopter rotor blades, while, obviously you don't want to get anything in a helicopter's rotor blade, the last thing any helicopter pilot would ever do would be to literally turn a helicopter down like that to just chop things up, because that obviously would catch the rotor blades and cause the helicopter to crash and explode. So it's definitely a little bit nonsensical. It's a great visual image and gives a nice moment on the soundtrack when you hear the whirring of the blades turn into chopping as it's just, cutting everything in sight, but definitely very unrealistic. However, this moment is wonderfully built up. The helicopter lowers itself in. They're at a dead end. And at the same time, they catch on what each other's thinking. Bond sees the laundry robe, Wei Lin sees what he's looking at, and then they both reach for it because she picks up on what Bond's thinking. She's on his same wavelength. So it's a really nice touch that they do that. And then Bond lays down the bike. Wei Lin knows what he's going to do. And they even, the goon inside the helicopter fires the machine gun down at them anyway to try and catch them. Now, the editing in the end part of that sequence is nice and tight until, if you look very closely at the helicopter going in, you can see there are dummies there. It holds it just a little bit much. I do like this interlude here where they're showering off in a street shower, and we see the child nudity on the side where the baby, the small child is getting washed. But I really like this little moment where Bond and Wei Lin are just showering off, and the back and forth, where Bond finally admits, that comes from not growing up at all. And I like the fact that he gets her to crack up a little, and then Bond washes her hair. And it's just this nice little human touch that does suggest Bond's humanity to Wei Lin if we're looking at it from a character standpoint. I like the visual of this scene. I like that it's backlit and everything. And of course, Wei Lin uses the magical lockpick earring, and then she locks Bond there, and he's kind of stupefied. Has to shake the water off, watch her go off. And my favorite part is he jerks the cuff off, which then sets the water going everywhere. So he's left looking a little nonplussed. It's not too much, but it's just enough. Most of all, I absolutely adore this music cue that David Arnold has come up for this sequence. It's very short, but we see Bond trying to trace Wei Lin through the streets. Can't exactly find where she's gone, but Arnold hits a very somber tone with this little cue, and he weaves in the surrender theme again or on piano very, very, very nicely. It's very subtle, but it's a particular mood he establishes here that I really enjoy, and I just wish there was more of it throughout the score. And here Bond sees another goon squad showing up, and since they're all obviously Chinese, I've always taken it to that maybe this is, from the General Chang side of things, so this is just part of General Chang's deal with Carver. Now, this scene was obviously designed to show off Michelle Yeoh's incredible talents as a stunt performer from her incredible work in Hong Kong films. And they actually did fly over the Jackie Chan stunt team that she was used to working with, because in Hong Kong they primarily are doing full contact blows instead of the traditional Hollywood style of no contact fights. And you really do feel it in this scene. And so it's unfortunate this is the main scene where Wei Lin gets to do, actual fighting, because everything else is much more limited. It's just this one scene where we get to see Michelle Yeoh really do what she would normally do in a Hong Kong film. But, it does allow Bond to get a glimpse again of Wei Lin's great ability and to sort of, just admire her work. This is a fun gag here where Bond is taking the lookout out of the equation, and he does the patting down of looking for a match. And again, it's a sort of joke about Bond giving up smoking, because smoking being seen as bad, and this, of course, is a PG-13 film, so of course Bond doesn't have a match and turns it into a great one-punch knockout. Then he's able to make his entrance at the right time. But Wei Lin already has something prepared, and she says literally, "I could have taken care of him." And she's happy. She's happy in a way that Bond is there. You can see it on her face, but she didn't need his assistance. And Bond picks up on this, and then immediately goes into copy of a Makarov 59 standard issue Chinese Army. And he brings this in to highlight the fact that they need to work together, because even Wei Lin can't rely on being able to, because now she's going to have to deal with the corruption of General Chang, because now there's actual Chinese agents after her inside the Chinese intelligence safe house. So that's obviously been blown, because she just dealt with an entire goon squad, obviously from, again, General Chang. And here we have the meeting of the minds, and you can see again Bond using his intelligence not only to piece together that those guys were Chinese army, but that the stealth material would not be best used for a stealth plane as Wei Lin's intelligence had pointed to, but that Bond correctly points out Carver would have built a stealth boat. That's how he would be able to best achieve his plot and how he would have been able to sink the Devonshire without anyone noticing. And again, that does harken back to Bond, of course, having a naval background, which is why he would immediately make that logical jump and then that conclusion. So this is, of course, the point at which Bond and Wei Lin lower their guards and finally start to work with each other. And it becomes the Q Lab de facto scene of the film because we didn't get Q's lab. Now we get the Chinese Q's lab. And originally there was a Chinese Q in earlier drafts of the script, but they dropped that. And honestly, I'm really glad they did because it allows the character interaction to sell the relationship between Bond and Wei Lin more. And we get the fun gag of Bond saying "you type" because the entire keyboard is in Chinese. Although, Bond did take that first in Oriental languages at Cambridge, but he obviously can't type as fast as Wei Lin on a Chinese keyboard. And now we get the traditional Q's lab setting off of all the gadgets, but now it's all done slightly at Bond's expense. And it's nice to see Bond's one-liners that normally are reserved for provoking Q get Wei Lin to laugh and interact with him more. I do think it's funny, the line about Bond picking up the watch and see a few improvements made. I can't help but think that's a joke about Chinese copies of products, trying to, copy famous products and make a cheaper alternative version. And so that's why Wei Lin says, oh, we made a few improvements. Now the gag here up on your left, Wei Lin completely nonplussed and able to take the guy out with... I guess it's a rickshaw part or something. And I like the fact that Bond is the one loading up. We see him basically kitting out for a military-style raid, and he gets to pick up a Walther P99, which is the point at which Bond switches from the iconic PPK to the brand new at the time Walther P99. Of course, we do see the PPK reappear on and off after this point, but here's where the P99 becomes the standard weapon of choice for the rest of the Brosnan era. And it's nice we at least get a visual moment to see that transition. So going to Halong Bay, this is actually quite near the iconic James Bond island from The Man with the Golden Gun. So this is around the same area in Phuket, Thailand. And of course, logically, the one place where mysterious things are going on and there have been disappearances and locals won't go near the place is, of course, where you would go and look for this stealth boat. However, Bond's line there about will the fishermen take a check? I always wondered, until I read Benson's novelization, I was like, oh, are they just writing the poor guy a bad check? Does Bond carry checks around? But Benson's novelization explains it that they actually go and get a check made, and so the poor fisherman doesn't get totally ripped off. Another interesting point about Benson's novelization that I don't know if it was in any of the script drafts, he has this scene end on a romantic note where Bond and Wei Lin actually get together, which again does make you think back to the boat scene in The Spy Who Loved Me between Bond and Triple X, where Anya does use her knockout cigarettes, but they do have a little romantic tryst of sorts. And honestly, the more I think about it, I think it fits because we have this ending note on, the back and forth about I don't even carry a little red book and you found the right corrupt, decadent Western agent as a partner, and they share a sort of look with each other. But, I think it may have helped the sort of budding relationship a little bit more, if since that's the route they were trying to go with, if there was maybe a kiss or something. So I really do like that Benson added that there. Again, I don't know if that was in an earlier script draft because he does have some sequences that are apparently based on an earlier script draft, which we'll get to in just a little bit with the ending of the stealth ship sequence. But I think that would have been a nice little moment to maybe add there. But that's kind of what they're going for in the dialogue. But ultimately, when you get to the sort of stare down between Bond and Carver, where Wei Lin is sort of in the balance, it definitely feels kind of forced. And another bit that Benson added that I really liked, because they kind of got together on the boat a little bit, when they get up here and they're starting to plant the mines, and Bond is sort of is definitely being a little protective of sorts. Wei Lin actually calls him out on it, and I really liked that moment. So again, I really wish that the other script drafts were available, the sort of in-between drafts between the original Bruce Fierstein draft with all the stuff that was scrapped, and of course the final version we have in the film where Fierstein had to do all the on-set rewriting. And of course, for all the talk about Wei Lin being Bond's equal, there are, some definite nods in the film and some moments where Bond's instincts do still have him being the superior agent. And of course, since this is a Bond film, you can't have the other agent showing up Bond at every single turn. And it's something you'll notice every time they pair Bond with the female equivalent agent. You see it in The Spy Who Loved Me, you see it in Moonraker, and you see it here in Tomorrow Never Dies. There are some specific moments where it's Bond's experience that make him not necessarily the better agent, but cause him to question things a bit more. And on the stealth ship, you see him notice the security cameras and then avoid them, which apparently Wei Lin doesn't notice all of them and eventually gets spotted, where we see Carver pick it up here. And this is a terribly funny gag where, if you ever wonder how Bond can always infiltrate the villain's lair, here we have the guard not paying enough attention to the monitors and Carver picking up on it and freaking out. And there was a deleted scene where they actually kill the guard there, which I kind of wish that had stayed in because it would add a little more gravity to that. So now Wei Lin has unfortunately been captured. And Bond's like, great, now my job's harder. And then there we have, for the second film in a row, we have a riff on the classic line for the Wild Bunch, if they move, kill 'em. So I don't know why that made it into Tomorrow Never Dies as well. There were two nods to the Wild Bunch in GoldenEye. One of them was a working of that line. So that reappears here in Tomorrow Never Dies for some reason. This is a really interesting and not quite graphic moment, but Bond just coldly stabs the guy in the chest, jumps him as the door opens. But this is really nice, where he grabs the guard's gun, fires blindly, and then uses the corpse to poke out a little bit. And then before anybody can notice, as Stamper fires, he then just shoves it off to fake his own death. It's a really nice little moment that, again, shows Bond's experience and ingenuity in the moment. So I've always really enjoyed that. It's a very brief thing, but that gives him an edge because now Carver believes he's dead, and Bond is able to infiltrate the stealth ship and get the layout and then set up his own backup plan to one-up Carver in the standoff that he creates. Again, a nice little knowing moment to talk to standard Bond cliches, if you will, where Carver has the line, bring Wei Lin up here. Why do you want to do that? It's my business. I like an audience. What's great is that Carver very rarely lets his emotions get the better of him. He has his ongoing mania, but now that Bond and Wei Lin have showed up, he doesn't let that affect him, and he's quite pleased that, again, he has an audience. And he can't resist trying to provoke Wei Lin with his Anchorman line about Bond. Her reaction, of course, does show that she does have developing feelings for Bond. Now, the bit with Carver sort of doing his own jokey kung fu, it's maybe a little much. Apparently, it was an improvisation by Jonathan Pryce on the set. The pathetic line works perfectly, but I don't know. I've gotten used to it over the years, but it can be a little off-putting, I guess. I like that M just burst into the Situation Room. Again, there's a little bit more of the political infighting in the novelization, and they've essentially sort of been locked out of the room while everybody's been just sitting there watching the screens, waiting for something to happen. Because, of course, the British military is right outside the territorial waters, and all this crisis is brewing. It's really interesting to note that while we're supposedly on the brink of World War III, you don't always get a sense of that throughout the film. At this point, we get the sense that the clock is ticking, but in that way, it's sort of like You Only Live Twice, where World War III and the whole crisis and the ticking clock, it's always kind of in the background. And the way that Carver lays out his machinations and the way he's enjoying it, and he's doing it very calmly. You can see how this might actually work, and that's what makes it so chilling. And it doesn't require him, setting off a chain of bombs. It's only one stolen cruise missile, and it's a British cruise missile. And then the bit with General Chang suddenly makes sense. And then it's like, oh gosh, that might actually work. Oh no. And then what's his actual reason for doing this? Oh, exclusive broadcast rights in China for the next 100 years. Now, of course, originally this was going to be about, and I should say in Fierstein's original draft of the film, the villain was Elliot Harmsway, and his ultimate goal was to get revenge on the Hong Kong handover, both on England and China, and also do this by, using stolen plutonium and hijacking a nuclear plant and causing a meltdown and such. And all the nuclear stuff seems to have made it over into World War enough. Now, the bit where Bond gets scooped at gunpoint and calls Carver is a nice reversal of the phone call in the BMW earlier, and we get that same line, but I think I have something here that belongs to you. And you get to see Carver have to take it, but he still has a comeback because he gets that great line, so much for German efficiency. Now, unfortunately, this scene goes into the ridiculous a little bit because Bond apparently does all of this just to get Wei Lin back. And even Wei Lin is like, what the hell are you doing? Shoot him already. And then Bond gets I told you we're going to finish this together. And even Stamper looks incredulously at this. I mean, of course, Bond is going to have to rescue Wei Lin somehow. And it does give Carver some great one-liners. Now he gets to reference Randolph Hearst and, of course, the obvious connections there. Bond gets to fire and kill the goon crawling up behind him and get I tuned out there for a minute. The nice touche. Of course, probably the best part of this is the fact that Gupta has outlived his usefulness. Apparently, poor Ricky Jay had a whole speech prepared, and then on the set, Jonathan Pryce just shot him before he could say it. Because he was like, oh, well, I thought that's what Carver would do. Unfortunately, Ricky Jay as Gupta gets so little to do in this film, and he's just kind of there. Now, I like the idea of the grenade hidden in the jar, and apparently that was a suggestion of Pierce Brosnan, who actually encountered something like that before. But originally, in some of the earlier drafts and in the novelization, Bond had basically cooked up an improvised bomb of sorts. And this is where the Danish I mentioned earlier came into play, that he says something to Wei Lin in Danish to warn her to, get down or something, and then he shoots the improvised bomb. So it's the same sort of effect, but in the film, we have it tied into the watch, and I guess that goes back to the line about the Chinese having made some improvements. So obviously that is the radar-controlled little charge that he takes out. And this is the point where Carver starts to lose his cool, because now the stealth ship is on fire and visible to radar. Now, the main change in the climax here is once the hole is blown in, the actual roof of the stealth ship, Bond and Stamper wind up on the outside of the stealth ship, and that's where they have their big physical battle, and Stamper actually gets impaled on some of the wreckage and is able to pull it out of himself and keep going because, again, he has that reversed pain and pleasure sensor in his head. So it becomes like a near impossible fight for Bond, and they manage to collapse down onto the missile platform. And there's this really cool moment where Bond and Stamper, because they're fighting on it, it keeps messing with the actual balance of the missile launching post itself, and then Stamper's body falls under the bottom of it, and before he can get up, he's balanced it just right. Carver's like, "Oh, stay there, it's perfect," and he fires it and he sacrifices Stamper, and Stamper gets to have an overload of pleasure as he's immolated to death. It's a very striking moment. It's in the novelization. Again, I don't know if it's something that Benson came up with, or again, I think at least a chunk of that is based off of the original, I guess, presumably the earlier drafts he was having to work from, because of course they will write the novelization before the film comes out. But we have it definitely plays out a bit differently here. And I mean, we still have the final bit happen on the actual missile platform, but Carver's demise is definitely a bit different, and the whole bit of Weyland getting recaptured and Bond having to rescue her again of sorts is definitely different. And again, that does go back to The Spy Who Loved Me. There's quite a bit of spy in the stealth ship ending. Not only does it make you think of the La Paris sequence and the giant battle inside once the sub-crews are freed, but we also have Bond having to rescue the heroine, although we're not obviously going to another location, going from the La Paris to Atlantis. We do get Weyland doing stuff here. Michelle Yeoh is getting to jump around with 2 giant machine guns, and obviously has to sabotage the engines. And of course, when confronted with a lot of buttons in an action movie, what does one do but just shoot a bunch of bullets at it? Because, of course, that always has to work. And, of course, in doing so, makes the stealth ship a sitting duck for the Royal Navy to finally be able to blast away at. Which, again, is also perhaps going to make you think of Thunderball and the Disco Volante and having to escape the Royal Navy again. Another little thing there, it bugs me a little bit in the soundtrack whenever you have a silenced pistol that has a sound effect where it's obviously not silenced. That's like one of the few little quibbles, because I've seen this film far too many times. And of course, the Bondian moment is that he's hijacked this missile platform and is now going to use it to further demolish all of the guards around him. And David Arnold complies with James Bond themed licks on the soundtrack. Now, there's a little bit of use of slow motion in this film, particularly here you see it in this sequence with Weyland. It's not really necessary, but at least it's kept to a very, minimal amount. And of course, again, Spottiswoode working with Sam Peckinpah, who was renowned for his revolutionary usage of slow motion in his editing of his films. Of course, it makes sense that Spottiswoode would be experienced with slow motion. But he does talk about in the commentary he was very hesitant to use it, and it was actually some of his editors who said, maybe you should use a little slow motion here and there. I like the moment where Bond runs, even though he's using 2 guns for some reason, when he runs out of ammo for the P99, he just immediately drops it and goes over to the MP5. And we use that as a match cut to Weyland, who's obviously down to like 2 bullets in the clip, and then uses it to hit the steam vents and fry the guards. Again, slight little bit of slow motion there when the shell hits. So now there's no way they'll be able to patch that. And again, in the novelization, there is this really interesting moment where they are able to patch the first hole, and then they become invisible again for a little bit of time before it's proven fruitless. But again, you don't get that in the film. I like the reaction shot of Carver where you can see the flames of the burning stealth ship in his eyeglasses. This shot of Bond here coming out of the wreckage, of course, makes you immediately think of Jaws coming out of wreckage. But I like that once we get that, then we see Stamper fire a grenade into the wreckage, supposedly you think where Bond was. But you see here, Carver still hasn't given up. That's what you have to admire him in a way. That in spite of, Bond continually provoking him and messing up all his great plans, he's still going, and he does try and keep that to the very end. Of course, you think Wayland is going to run into Bond, but in a nice little bit of misdirection, goes into Stamper's gun barrel. Once again, David Arnold working in the James Bond theme. It's a nice little moment where, of course, the explosion goes off right as Bond swings over. He's got a nice little bit of wear and a little bit of blood on the face. I like how he just coldly walks up and starts blasting away at the captain and the control panel, and all the glass goes out. And, of course, you have to have the villain come in somewhere. And even though he isn't the physical threat for Bond, he does manage to get the one-up on him for just a moment. And then the explosion causes a pause, which allows Bond to look over. And then the last thing we see is we're able to see the sea drill. And you can see the teeth start to move a little bit after the movement caused by the explosion. You see Carver relishing this moment, and already he's still not giving up. And he's like, aha, now the British Navy will destroy the evidence once I fire the missile. You're still too late. Again, he never gives up, which I have to admire. What's also great about this sequence is the sea drill was real, and the teeth are really steel, and there's nothing between it and the actors. So they did this for real, and Jonathan Pryce relied on Pierce Brosnan to be there to pull him out of the way if it got too close, because he has his back to it. Of course, this is a very horrible death for anybody, and it does allow you to sort of relish and allow Bond to relish the moment and get revenge for everyone in the film. And, of course, harkening back, you have to think about Paris as well. So this bit here with the missile and Stamper reappearing with Wayland, not only does it allow us to have Wayland get rescued, but also it takes the place of the semi-traditional final fling, as it were, with the henchman that would usually come up right before the end credits. Once you think the story's over, then there's the one final flourish with death. That's what this sequence does. But of course, it's once Carver's dead, you think, oh, we'll stop the missile and that's it. No, we got to have the one more action beat. And of course, because Wayland is drowning, that obviously means this scene has to take place very quickly because of the human endurance to hold one's breath underwater can only be about a minute or two max. And depending on how much you're able to hold your breath under these extreme circumstances and going down. So that doesn't leave you a lot of time for a very involved fight scene. And you can see Stamper here is wanting to get revenge for his father figures of both Carver and Kaufman. And we get the bits here about him not being able to feel pain. And you'll see when Bond stabs him, of course, he does stab him at one point in the arm, which is the definite nod to Red Grant, because, of course, Red Grant is stabbed in the arm at first. And you see Stamper laugh. So, again, when he's stabbed in the chest, he laughs because, of course, he again, is supposed to be feeling pleasure. The other little bit I love, anytime you have a German villain in a movie, usually the one German word they have in their dialogue, and the rest is in English, there's always a 9 thrown in there somewhere, usually. And I think it's interesting that the sort of actual destruction of the missile is almost sort of matter of fact, because it's just the detonators Wayland through the Bond that happen to be magnetic. And perhaps in a reverse of the Living Daylights, now Bond saves himself by cutting his own clothes. So instead of cutting his boot off to kill Necros, now he cuts his own vest to save himself. And I like the fact that he uses the knife he implanted in Stamper's chest and has to rip it out and then cut his own vest off, and then Stamper's just kind of like, ugh. And you see the determination in Bond's face underwater. Wayland's literally on her last leg. And then Bond finally does kiss her, and it's a kiss of life type moment. And it's perfectly timed with the explosion overhead. And we see the massive flames go off, which look really impressive underwater, and it just lights up their faces. And again, that was done for real, so that was literally, hey, whatever you do, don't surface because you'll be on fire. But it's a really beautiful moment, and David Arnold goes for broke with the score. It really works. And once again, we have the surrender theme. So again, that song is through the entire score and was intended by the composer to be the title song of the film. They obviously just decided to do something else. So it is fitting that we finally do get that at the end credits, and the film is built up to it. And again, I really do like its placement. Now, the actual end shot here is obviously a direct nod to the Goldfinger type ending. But it's always seemed a bit weird to me that Bond and Wayland just decide, we'll just stay on the flaming wreckage and start making out, and we won't get picked up by the Royal Navy. And yeah, sure, this is a great spot to start making out on this flaming wreckage in the middle of the ocean. Now, of course, the line here M has about, Carver supposedly committing suicide was another linkage to actual real-life media moguls, because, of course, Carver was a sort of amalgam of various figures. And this whole bit is very knowing at the way a Bond film can end. Again, a little bit of slow motion there on the close-up of Bond and Wayland. So this is, of course, the point where they finally get together at the very end, again, a la Goldfinger. So the film ends on a classical Bond note. I wish there had been a little bit more that built up to the final coupling of Bond and Wayland, but it works well enough, and again is a classical Bond ending. And then we get the final credit being the dedication to Cubby Broccoli, who, of course, unfortunately passed away in between the production of GoldenEye and Tomorrow Never Dies. So while he had been an advisor on GoldenEye, this was the first film where it was Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson completely and totally on their own, without him even as an advisor. So now we're into the Katie Lang Surrender song, which again was intended as the title song by David Arnold. Lyrics by Don Black. It's a very traditional feeling Bond song, and most fans really do prefer it to the Sheryl Crow title song. There have been some fan attempts to recut it into the title sequence, which are really impressive, and it is interesting to try and picture that in the title sequence that Danny Kleinman made. But I still love it at its placement at the end titles, and I think it's very effective on the end, and I don't mind it being relegated to the end titles, but it is noteworthy that it was the intended song and is woven all throughout the score. So obviously it's at least it's in the film, thankfully, but it is a fantastic song that unfortunately doesn't get played along with the official title theme songs as often as it should. So it's sort of joined the small little crew of the end title songs and incidental songs that are of the Bond franchise, but are not the actual title song. So Tomorrow Never Dies closes on a nice little traditional nod. The whole climax has a feel of The Spy Who Loved Me, and then the final fade out is done in the Goldfinger style, which it works, and it gives a good little close to the film, and it works to get it out under 2 hours. There's the all-important credit. This film was edited on Avid. It was the first film in the series to be edited digitally, and the increase in time, because digital editing usually takes less time than editing on film, they were able to have the film done on time with a near non-existent post-production schedule. And I mean, it's a real testament to Roger Spottiswoode and the entire production team that they're able to pull this off because, again, this production was very fraught with problems and difficulties. And again, the more you dig into it, you can poke holes in it, but as it's really the Bond film that you kind of have to take as a ride of sorts. And when it's enjoyed in a proper theater environment or a home theater, I think it plays a bit better. And it's really impressive how much of this film has really grown on the world over time. So it still has a panache to it, even though some people may accuse it of being a little machine-like. And what I love particularly about the end credits and the way Surrender plays out, the way the music plays out, when we get the final production credit, it's like it just swims up. And I have a particular thing about well-placed credits for the James Bond Will Return credit. It's perhaps the most important credit of all. And the way it just fits in perfectly. And then we get the Tomorrow Never Dies from UA logo right as the song plays out to its end. I just love the way that sort of swims up. And even though we don't get the sort of custom image like we used to with particularly the Bond films of the 80s where they would pick a singular image for the James Bond Will Return credit, I do really like how that plays out with the end of Surrender. Well, that does it for the film, and again, Tomorrow Never Dies is really surprising at how much it grows on you. It does have its fans, and it does have its number of detractors, but I think you really have to dig into the production history, and you have to come to this film understanding that MGM really insisted on having another Bond film, and then everybody nixed the original script about being about the Hong Kong handover. And so there's a lot of stuff that went into the pre-production of the film, and then the whole notion of rewriting the script as it went along and incurring a lot of improvisation and really going in with, sort of a backbone dating back to the original Bruce Fierstein story, and then building stuff around the main action set pieces. It sort of starts to make sense why the film as it stands turned out the way it did. And again, I know he probably wasn't the most well looked upon director in the series once they finished, due to the production being so fraught with difficulties. But you have to hand it to Roger Spottiswoode and the editors and everybody in the production crew for being able to pull this off in time and still make it polished enough. And again, when you read that first Bruce Fierstein draft and you see how problematic it was and how it really needed polishing, the final film does make a hell of a lot of improvements to that first draft. I think it really improves on that first draft in every single area. And again, it's interesting to see what of those elements from that first draft literally seemingly get recycled into the world is not enough. We have all the plutonium stuff and the return of Valentin Zukovsky. There's a lot of things in there that seem to have gotten taken off into the world is not enough. And again, the whole thing about Stamper not being able to feel pain, again, feels like it was the dry run for Renard, even though we don't really get that stuff in the film. It's not very obvious. Apparently that was there. Again, I wish I knew if Raymond Benson's novelization was. I'm assuming he had to have been basing it off of an earlier draft that he was provided with, which it does sometimes happen in the writing of film novelizations. I will admit that I did finally appreciate Whalen a lot more once I read the extra bits of character that he gave to her. There's an extra scene or two that he came up with that I really enjoy. So a little bit like Natalia and Goldeneye that I came to appreciate more once reading John Gardner's novelization that gave her a whole backstory. It allowed me to read more into the character in the film and give that character a little more weight because unfortunately, as much as I love Michelle Yeoh, particularly in her Hong Kong films and other things, and while she has great chemistry with Pierce Brosnan and she's a great presence on screen, unfortunately, she doesn't get all that much to do, and the whole notion of Wayland being Bond's equal and all that stuff. Yeah, that's true and fine and all, but you don't really feel it. It definitely has a sort of flat feeling to it, and it never feels as effective as you would wish it to be. Sort of just like the romance between the two characters that is traditional and does develop in the film, but it doesn't feel natural. It does kind of feel a little bit forced because obviously we're getting close to the end of the film and they're going to have the final fade out clinch with each other. So it's just kind of like, oh, we got to get through that. And then you get that moment in the standoff with we told you we're going to finish this together. And it's a bit like, the audience groans a little bit. It's like, oh yeah, we know. Can we get this over with? It's a bit obvious. So again, I really do appreciate those extra little bits that are in the novelization. And again, it's interesting to look at what Benson did with that and then go and look at his first James Bond novel, 0-10, which was published the same year as the film, that did deal with the Hong Kong handover and did have its villain, Guy Thackeray, trying to get revenge on both Britain and China, just like the original Tomorrow Never Dies villain of Elliot Harmsway was doing. And again, the fact that these both came out in the same year of 1997, the year of the handover, I think proved that it wasn't a problem to set a Bond film around the story of the Hong Kong handover. And Benson does a very nice job with his first attempt at a Bond novel, which actually was his first major published novel as well, which was obviously would be a daunting task to anyone. So it's a nice way to look at sort of what a Bond film could have been about that real life event. But of course, MGM were all against that idea because, again, they felt that would have dated the film. And obviously, the film would come out in November, December of that year, whereas the actual handover happened much earlier in the year, like April, May. And so the fear was like the audience wouldn't get into it as much because, of course, the event had already happened. And thus, the film would already feel dated within that same year. I do think that's understandable, and I can see why they did that. But then I think they should have given everyone more time to develop a new story idea and not insisted on that winter 97 release date, because that also put them in competition against the looming box office killer that, of course, was James Cameron's Titanic that, destroyed box office records everywhere. And Tomorrow Never Dies still did very well and still, relatively matched the success of GoldenEye and was a, feather in MGM's cap for 1997. But I do think that its ultimate success was, curtailed definitely a bit by Titanic, which again, destroyed box office records and had a very long engagement in theaters over a long period of time. So I don't think it would have hurt MGM all that much to, push off Tomorrow Never Dies till maybe, even an extra month or two and have Tomorrow Never Dies open in January or February of 98 with much less competition around. But I think it would have given the production team enough time to, again, finesse the script a bit more. That's really all that's missing, I think. It needs finessing of the story to make it feel less of an action thrill ride. But again, I have to point out, I think the editing and the faster pacing and the shorter runtime help to sort of not iron out the problems, because you still find them, but it does help make them stick out less. And again, the whole film is really edited on a dime, and every shot is cut at a particular moment. It's not held too long, and we do still get nice transitional moments and nice bits of character, and we're not just rushing through every last little thing. So it manages to stand on its own, even compared to GoldenEye, and I think it is really the most underrated film of the Brosnan tenure, and it's the one that is the most surprising, because it's the one film of the four that I've found myself coming around on the most, whereas the others I had a good handle on. Tomorrow Never Dies is very deceptive. You seem to want to take it as one way, and as a film that's all about action and not having a lot of substance, and then you read into the production materials and you're like, oh, well, that's why that happened, and that explains a lot, and then you just want to write it off and take it as it is. But every time you rewatch the film, it opens up a little bit more. There's a bit more there. You can see what they were after and trying to increase the character moments and all the stuff they were trying to do with Paris Carver and trying to appease Brosnan, wanting more to really act into. He wanted more drama to sink his teeth into. He always wanted to get under Bond's skin. He wanted to really, in a way, sort of his Bond is like the Bond of analysis. We get that in GoldenEye, and we get that in both The World's Not Enough and Die Another Day. He's trying to get under the character of Bond, to get there under the skin, and really take apart and examine what makes this man tick, and how does Bond do these Bondian things, and what is the humanity like under all of that. And it's a really interesting approach that I really don't think ever got seen at its full fruition, as it were. And I think that's what he was always pushing for, and we see a sort of acknowledgement of that in the next film, "On the World's Not Enough," where they're trying to do more of that, and you do get nice bits of character and things, and the action gets dialed back a bit, but does have the requisite bombast when it needs it. But on that film, I think the action kind of sticks out some. Whereas here in Tomorrow Never Dies, I do think everything is actually integrated quite well. And again, I do think a lot of that is due to the tighter editing, which I do think The World's Not Enough could have used a little bit more of. So I really do think Tomorrow Never Dies is actually quite rewarding, and it surprises you. And over time, the plot has become even more prescient, because in 1997, the idea of a media baron manipulating world news to the extent of starting his own war for his own personal gain and controlling the entire interest of the world seemed much more far-fetched than now, where it seems terrifying and extremely prescient. And of course, now Tomorrow Never Dies, most often when it gets referenced, it's usually in news articles where they're talking about the power of the media and media manipulation and world events. So it's not viewed as the stuff of fiction anymore. So I think that has only increased its power in the modern age. So again, I think it's a film that actually plays better now than it did on its release in 1997. And again, it's all the more impressive because it is a film, while there is some CG usage, it is dialed in perfectly to make things seamless. It doesn't take over things. And this is still a primarily practical effects film with fantastic stunt sequences that does do the traditional Bond globetrotting and does give you your money's worth. And it is an action thrill ride that has a tighter runtime. And there is something to a Bond film that runs under 2 hours. There really is. It was something that I think Peter Hunt intrinsically understood. And there's a certain magic of the initial 3 Bond films being, just about the shortest films in the series. And, in spite of that, having all the iconic moments you remember and having this furious energy to them, this pacing that gives them an excitement and a danger factor. While I don't think Tomorrow Never Dies ever quite hits that, it does have that nice kick in the pants to it that, again, this is the fastest moving Bond film since You Only Live Twice, really, which really says something considering all the action that takes place, and while still providing nice bits of character. And I have to mention again, Jonathan Pryce's Elliot Carver really has opened up for me over the years, and I just find all these great nuances to look into his characterization, and again, chiefly the way he builds these manias into Carver's speeches, and just the look that he gets in his eyes just sells Carver's insanity and his near achieving of his goals. and the fact that he continues to move up his timetables and doesn't give up and constantly retweaks his plan to catch up against Bond's continual meddling. And of course, again, the traditional Bond villain back and forth is there, and there's a sort of personal angle to all of this, because of course the emotional context is Paris, and Bond is trying to get revenge for her as well as stop World War III. So there's that personal edge as well that gives Bond the extra motivation to take Carver down. So while Tomorrow Never Dies does have its share of problems, I do think almost all of those can be traced directly back to the extremely difficult production. It's really a miracle that they finished this film on time. And incredible that it's so polished and it's so well put together that if you weren't looking for this stuff, most people can go in and watch it as a straightforward film and get perfect enjoyment out of it. Again, that's not to say it doesn't have its issues, but it's amazing to see how well put together it is. So I find it's a film that really has grown on me over the years. I've always enjoyed it, but it's a film that's really come around in my own personal estimation of it, and I think a lot of other people's as well. And as I'm saying more and more with these tracks, it's really a kind of film that no one makes anymore. Yes, there is a greater percentage of action, but it's action that's actually being done practically for real in front of your eyes on a very large scale. It's a fantastic theatrical experience with, again, one of my all-time favorite sound mixes. It's an absolute powerhouse of a 5.1 surround track. And again, you're missing like 50 or 60% of the experience if you don't watch this film in at least a home theater environment. You really do not get the impact of this film. And once you hear the sound mix in its full glory, it really does help sell this film a lot more. So this is definitely a Bond film to be experienced. Again, it is a bit more of a thrill ride in terms of the action set pieces kind of taking things over, but it does have that nice shorter runtime that keeps everything from dragging and going on too long. And again, it is nice to see a Bond film clock in under 2 hours again for the first time in a very long time. So Tomorrow Never Dies is a nice film to come back to, and a film that really does, I think, open up over time. So I hope it has been as rewarding to me as it was to you to listen to me babble on about Tomorrow Never Dies or Bond 18 and sort of relive first seeing it back in 97 theatrically, which again is still an experience I vividly remember. This is a film I still enjoy running in my own home theater regularly. It's one of the great films to make your neighbors run for the hills or hate you. But as always, thank you ever so much for listening. I hope this has been informative. Hopefully you got something out of this. And again, thank you for letting me babble on with my various musings about James Bond, which is something that I do in my everyday life to a lot of blank stares and people who don't speak James Bond. So it's a pleasure and a thrill to do these, and I will return soon with my commentary for The World Is Not Enough. So with that, as always, I'm very humbly yours, the motion picture analyst,